You're telling guys if you're one day bored enough, you'll fuck them. Vinny'd be like, "Hey guys, hey everybody. I just want everyone to know I called this long."
Franklin never told.
Cool dog. Vinny'd be like, "Cool dog."
His mother about Alice, and to ensure she did not know too much about his private life, had used a secret code in his terse diary. But within weeks of his party, carry a big stick, and you will go far. The American expansionism Roosevelt had advocated.
Oh, yes, I know. Something can be up with you. Oh, yeah, good, man. Oh, fuck. Yoshi. Hey, Yoshi.
Days at the Navy Department had succeeded beyond his dreams. The United States was now a world power. It had annexed Hawaii, driven Spain from the New World, dominated Cuba and Puerto Rico, wrested the Philippines from the Spanish, and then begun a brutal, bloody campaign to subjugate the Philippine people, who wanted to be free of foreign rule by anyone, including Americans.
What's this motherfucker's name?
Tens of thousands died so that the United States could gain a foothold in the Pacific. To anti-imperialists like Mark Twain, such military adventures betrayed American principles, and Roosevelt himself was nothing more than a showy charlatan.
I am an anti-imperialist. I am opposed to having the eagle put its talons on any other land.
Criticism did not much, and uncivilized nations that produced raw materials, bought products instead of manufacturing them, and were incapable, he believed, of self-government. The great enemy of civilization was what he called chaos. To combat it, it was the duty of civilized and orderly powers to police the rest. Britain should be responsible for India and Egypt. Japan, which Roosevelt now numbered among the civilized nations, because the United States, and only the United States, must police the Western Hemisphere. It was called the Roosevelt Corollary to the
imperialism had never worked, and had he tried to be more imperialistic than he was, he would have been stopped. I think he should have been in dealing with foreign nations, and particularly if he thought they were inferior to our way of life or to us as a people. His very high-handed treatment of the inexcusable.
For Roosevelt, one great expansionist vision remained unfulfilled. For more than half a century, American and European investors had dreamed of a Central American canal linking the Atlantic to the Pacific. Roosevelt believed such an interocean pathway was now already trying to build a canal across the jungle-covered Panama province in the nation of Colombia. But that effort had stalled, a victim of poor planning, lack of money, and deadly tropical diseases. When the French offered to sell their rights, Roosevelt agreed to buy them, then instructed his Secretary of State, John Hay, to negotiate a treaty with Colombia. It called for a payment of $10 million, plus an annual rental fee for a 6-mile canal zone across the isthmus. The refusal of the Colombian Senate to honor its government's commitment
would be good for the United States and good for civilization. It would also be good for Theodore Roosevelt. He often mingled those three. And he believed that any government, any person who stood in the way
This game's over.
was obstructing
Now what?
civilization. And Roosevelt had very little patience for those people who
That's tomorrow.
didn't see the way
He had resolved
You want to sell your home, call Seller's Advantage. Everyone has different reasons for selling. Some people are selling. Seller's Advantage has a custom
Via directly, but he would exploit the aspirations of the people of Panama Province, who had for 50 years asserted their wish to be in. It was a delicate conversation. What did the Frenchman think was going to happen in Panama Province? Mr. President, his visitor said, a revolution.
He had no assurances in any way. He's a very able fellow. It's his business to find out what he thought about a government would do. I have no doubt that he was able to make a very accurate guess and to advise his people accordingly. In fact, he would have been a very dull man had he been unable to make such a guess.
5 days later, the rebels proclaimed their independence. An American cruiser landed troops to overcome the handful of Colombian soldiers the revolutionaries hadn't already bought off. It was all over within 72 hours. The president was presiding at a cabinet meeting at 11:35 on the morning of November 6, 1903, when a messenger brought him the happy news. By the time lunch was served, the United States had recognized the brand new Republic of Panama. The people of the Isthmus, Roosevelt would claim, rose literally as one man. Yes, said a Senate critic, and that man was Roosevelt. Work on the Great Canal began again, but now it was an American project. And Roosevelt himself would not be able to resist seeing it for himself.
I'm sure it's looking down the internet. I don't want to just be show Saturday night. I want to be a part of it. So naming is on the agenda tonight. I know
I'm coming to you for a second.
last week before you were talking about stuff going on and
The country while in office.
the program as well. Oh, of course, I want to talk about status
Panama Canal is one of the great achievements of the human race. All kinds of ancillary benefits, conquest of disease, and other things. And it's the sort of thing that America did just to affirm its greatness. It's better to do it that way than conquering other people. This was a wholly beneficial
Kind of
addition. Now we
They
did
should
get
kind of-
the last deal with certain Central American countries. But as was said at the time of the Panama Canal Treaty, we stole it fair and square.
I took the canal zone and let Congress debate. While the debate goes on, the canal does too. And now, instead of discussing the canal before it was built, which would have been harmful, they merely discuss me. A discussion which I regard with benign interest.
For Thanksgiving that year, Franklin Roosevelt and his mother traveled to the Delano family homestead at Fairhaven, Massachusetts. rather than face the prospect of being at something to tell her. He had fallen in love with his fifth cousin, Eleanor Roosevelt, the orphan daughter of the president's late brother, Elliot. He had asked her to marry him. She had said yes. Sarah was stunned. They were too young, she thought. Franklin was just 21, Eleanor only 19, and if they married, she feared she would be left alone. Franklin did his best to reassure her. You know, dear Mummy, and always will be to each other, he wrote. Only now you have two children to love and to love you.
It is impossible for me to tell you how I feel toward Franklin. I can only say that my one great wish is always to prove worthy of it. I know just how you feel and how hard it must be. But I do want you to learn to love me a little.
Being loved a little was the best Eleanor Roosevelt dared wish for. Franklin had always been so secure in every way, she remembered. And then he just
Remember listening to good questions?
Her beautiful mother, Anna Hall, had been distracted, disappointed in her daughter's looks, and called her Granny.
She made her feel unattractive, and she made her feel diminished. And Eleanor Roosevelt grew up really feeling both that her mother didn't love her and that she failed her mother.
Her mother was very beautiful, quite self-obsessed. But she was subject to headaches, and she would allow Eleanor to rub her forehead and soothe her for hours. And she says in her autobiography that was when she realized that the way to be loved was to be of use to others. And that lesson she never forgot.
I can't even bear to think of what it was like for her when her mother would call her Granny, and yet to be able somehow, because of that sadness, to connect to other people for whom fate had also dealt an unkind hand. Somehow that connection gave her the strength because her vulnerability could be expressed by helping them.
Her largely absent father, whom she idealized and would never stop yearning for, had in reality been an erratic alcoholic and delusional. From afar, he sent her letters full of promises he could never keep. She would come and care for him someday, he said. They would travel the world together. He would show her the Taj Mahal by moonlight.
Eleanor Roosevelt suffered all her life from the romanticism that happens when you lose a parent. She had the notion that somehow her mother had driven her wonderful father away when her father was in fact an alcoholic. And she believed somehow, the way small children do, that the absent parent is a sort of fairy tale person. She never stopped believing. When she was an old lady, she asked a clergyman if she might possibly be reunited with him in heaven. So it really was a lifelong, unexamined thing. And it gave her a sort of unrealistic view of what men could be.
Both her parents were dead by the time she was 10. She and her younger brother Hall, for whom she would always feel responsible, were sent off to live with her grim, pious maternal grandmother in Tivoli, New York. An abusive nurse was with her day and night. An unstable aunt lived at home. So did two drunken uncles. None of them was much interested in Eleanor. She was a lonely little girl, she remembered. Timid, withdrawn, and frightened of practically everything. Mice, the dark, other children, displeasing the people I lived with. During her infrequent visits to Sagamore Hill, Theodore Roosevelt was always especially warm toward his late brother's daughter. He once hugged her so hard, he tore the buttonholes out of her petticoat.
Well, she spoke about him when she was a child, and how she was very fearful of the visits to his family, because they were a rowdy bunch of kids having a good time rushing around. And also, when her uncle discovered she couldn't swim, he threw her into the water. And then she was scared of water all her life.
Poor little soul. She is very plain, the president's wife, Edith Roosevelt, had written. Her mouth and teeth seem to have no future. It was the president's sister, Bammy, who would indirectly be Eleanor's salvation. Bammy had once spent a season studying overseas with an exchange at the Sylvester's Girls' School, just outside London, Allenswood.
I felt that I was starting a new life. Traditions. This was the first time in all my life that all my fears left me.
Eleanor spent 3 years at Allenswood, the happiest of her life, she remembered. Mademoiselle Souvestre insisted that her students and socially conscious. Why was your mind given you, she liked to ask her students, but to think things out for yourself? She devoted herself to the tall, diffident American orphan and brought out all the tact and intelligence, discipline and energy and empathy that would characterize her later in life. In those 3 years of contact with a liberal mind and strong personality. But when she was 17, her grandmother insisted she end her schooling and come home to prepare for her debut in New York society.
Society, you went to fancy dress balls and you got married at 18. And Eleanor Roosevelt was quite miserable about that. And always, to the end of her life, complained about how she was deprived of what she always wanted, a real education.
She spent that summer back in Tivoli, where one of her alcoholic uncles had become so uncontrollable he could not be discouraged from spraying buckshot from his bedroom window at anyone who dared venture. It was not, she remembered, a very good preparation for being a gay and joyous debutante.
I imagine that I was well dressed, but there was absolutely nothing about me to attract anybody's attention. By no stretch of the imagination could I fool myself into something.
On November 17th, 1902, just 5 weeks after Franklin Roosevelt had said goodbye to Alice Sawyer, he had
says that, how about Koala Kirk? From Jim Riverside, how about Gridlock? Oh, boy, or next show. There you go. Hey, Koala. Sorry to hear the show. I got a name. I'm not sure if it's going to sound good or not. I got tea time or Koala time. I don't know. Might sound good. Might not. Take a choice. The suggested name for your show is...
Hello, it's DJ from the IE, and I think that you should name your show Wall to Wall with the Wallet, This Saturday Holler with the Wallet, or Hard to Swallow with the Wallet. Congratulations on your show, and we'll be listening.
Hey, Koala, Steve Bakersfield again. The show which shall remain unnamed. My suggestion, Koala Shark on Point, or On Point with Koala Shark. Yeah. The Koala Shark. S-O-U-L, capital, C-A-L, SoCal, Koala Shark. It's my throat. Nice turn on the air. Wait, over there. Over there. Wait, just that back. That mask. There's something about that. The Koala Shark. S-O-U-L, capital, C-A-L, SoCal, Koala Shark. This is my throat. Nice turn on the air. Wow. Wait a minute. I thought of the name SoCal Saturdays with Koala Shark dressed in S-O-C-A-L. Saturdays with Koala Shark. But man, I think it was our on something. SoCal Saturdays with Koala Shark. I'm soulful. Brother. Really? Yes. All right. I want to get to the heart and soul of what's happening in the Southland. SoCal Saturday with Koala Shark.
So you feel like, ooh, so like that.
Love
Like that.
I'm there. You know, one of my favorite shows growing up was Soul Train. Yeah. There's a lot of there. Wow, I thought by the end of this segment, it was going to be city to city. And as I was thinking about it, I don't want to fight off of coast to coast. You go coast to coast, city to city. It's a little too much of it. You know, if I was on a different station, I may not care to say they're on city to city. They're on coast to coast. But coast to coast is kind of, they've already covered the two. To cover the two, covering what's happening. But there's so much meaning to that. You know what? Yeah. I'm done. I am going to go with SoCal Saturday with the Wallace.
Love it. Better than yours? Mine's
Party in here. I see the Soul Train line happening outside. We are popping bottles in the studio because we have come up with a name. SoCal Saturday with Koala Shark, digging into what is happening in Southern California from the IE to LA to, everything happening in Warren County, getting to the heart and soul of the matter. I'm absolutely with that.
That's a good one. Love it.
Roosevelt cousins were invited to sit in his half-brother Rosie's special box, including Eleanor. She and Franklin had seen one another casually at family events over the years, but now he asked to see her again, and again, and again.
It happened on the rebound. She was also Theodore Roosevelt's favorite niece, but I think that was a very small part of the equation. She was very intelligent. She was very substantive. There was a lot there. He was fascinated by her substance, I think. He truly did love her. I think that's very important to understand.
I think he saw in Eleanor somebody who had deeper complexities. The part of him that wanted to reach out to other people if he cared about issues. I don't know how many other women in that social world that he was in would have talked that same way to him. Perhaps it was opposites attracting in some ways. He saw that stubbornness in her, that idealism. He was much more pliable in a certain sense. But it speaks really well of the depth to him that many people might not have seen at the time that Eleanor was the girl that he fell in love with.
A little over a year later, he invited her to Cambridge for the Harvard-Yale game. That evening, he wrote another entry in his diary. After lunch, I have a never to be forgotten.
His personality so crowds the room that the walls are worn thin and threaten to burst outwards. You go to the White House and hear him talk, and then go home to wring the person out of your clothes. Richard Washburn Child.
As the 1904 presidential election drew near, the executive mansion, newly rebuilt, refurbished, and official.
White House chief of staff Ron Slade is expected to step down in the coming weeks. Beyonce did her first live show in more than 40 years in Dubai today, part of the launch of the new Atlantis Royal Hotel. Reportedly, Queen Bee ranked $24 million to do the gig. Southern California weather from KFI. The sun shone today and likely will do so for the next 5 days or so. Highs today are hitting the mid-60s in LA and OC. Tonight, chilly again. Highs from the high 30s to the mid-40s. Weather is brought to you by Norm Reed's Honda Superstore. Let's check KFI traffic dates from the David Zachary. He had some more high cars on the one. At South LA on Western Northern Expedition Boulevard, that crash has been with the right shoulder. It's still back up to Vernon Avenue. 7 Bar 60 West 11th Avenue. That's a crash also moved to the right shoulder. It was started in the right lane. It's the heavy back up in Grand Avenue. That will do on PTA, both north and southbound at Tuna Canyon Road. That's a fire being reported on the freeway over in the hills. Fire crews are obviously trying to extinguish it. Both lanes of the side are closed down due to the fire. It's backed up all the way down to Sunset Boulevard. In Hollywood, on the 101 South of Vermont Avenue, that's the crash in the center lane. It's going to have it back up to the Hollywood Boulevard in Santa Ana, 55 South before Dyer Road. That's a sofa in the middle lane. KFI is trying to see their faster. I'm Zachary Hagan. If all home air purifiers are the same, then why did the U.S. Department of Defense select EnviroCleanse to protect and purify the air on board our Navy ships? Because EnviroCleanse advanced mineral technology. You'll also receive a free air quality monitor plus fast-free shipping. That's $150 in savings. KPure.com, promo code Conway. KPure.com, promo code Conway. You and your kids' Sunday movie at Hardware Shop Super Enough Stress. Engage in 60 minutes of physical activity every day. A personal dance party. Almost grab the block. Or this yoga can also.
Oh, done. My video ended, done. Oh, yo, do you remember when it was
Worried or frustrated. CalHope can help. Access CalHope's free answer mental health 313-173 or live chat at calhope.org. Nothing like winter weather to make a hibernate with a warm drink. Here's a big item that crossed off your to-do. Well, pop up on the couch. Take care of that old car you've been meaning to deal with. Donate it to Cars for Kids, the top car donation charity in the U.S. Call 877 Cars for Kids or go to carsforkids.org. Car schedule for pickup before your month cools down. You'll get a tax deductible receipt and a voucher for a 3-day hotel stay. Call 877 Cars for Kids or carsforkids.org. That's Cars for the Day. I'm Dr. Erica Pond with the California Department of Public Health.
Renamed the White House mirrored Theodore Roosevelt's enthusiasms. Footmen wore blue and white Roosevelt livery. The president's gilt initials gleamed from the sides of 3 new carriages, stared down from the walls of the state dining
I
room.
remember when it was like, hey, we were doing a thing.
Theodore and Edith Roosevelt delighted in the company of writers, artists, and musicians who were frequent visitors to the White House. The pianist Paderewski performed at one of Edith's musicales. So did a promising young cellist named Pablo Casals. The president invited John Singer Sargent to live with the first family, and when Roosevelt learned that his favorite poet,
created by award-winning artists, enriched by spectacular sound, meet colorful characters, and journey with them through wondrous realms. Experience Awakening. Get your tickets at awakening.com.
when Arlington Robinson was working 12 hours a day in the New York subway, he got a less demanding position at the New York Customs House.
Treated thousands of people. He's my dentist, and it's my daughter Pamela's dentist, and boy, he saved her. She had some really complicated dental issues. So whether you need one tooth or several missing teeth replaced, LA Dentist Group team of specialists will restore your smile. And you can do it in one day and while you sleep. And if you already have implants that have gone south,
A poet, he said.
Another dentist, Dr. Messarkani can fix those problems too. Smile again, the boobs that you've missed, dial pound 250 on the cell, and just say dentist. Pound 250 on the cell, say dentist. Schedule a free exam including x-rays and CT scans. Some restrictions apply. LADentistGroup.com. LADentistGroup.com. Following the Bible year, that draft process. That you experience the story of the Bible through live action recordings and emotional orchestral music.
Can do much more for this country than the proprietor of a nail factory. The public loved reading about the Roosevelt White House, but they clamored to see the president in person, and he was more than happy to oblige. Huge crowds turned out to see him wherever he went, and he went everywhere.
Whenever I stopped at a small city or country town, I was greeted by the usual shy, self-conscious, awkward body of local committeemen who spoke to the usual audience of thoroughly good American citizens. That is, the audience consisted of the townspeople from 10 or 20 or even 30 miles roundabout. For all the superficial differences between us, down at bottom these men and I think a good deal alike, or at least have the same ideals. And I am always sure of reaching them in speeches which many of my Harvard friends would think not only homely, but commonplace.
He was the first American that in American politics. And I think part of the immense appeal of Roosevelt is that he didn't shed that background. He didn't try to talk like the ordinary folk. His upper class accent, his upper class taste, once people got over that, then they realized we love him because he is this way. Because he isn't trying to be just like we are. He's himself, and he's resolutely himself all through his life.
Judge Alton B. Parker of New York for president, an able jurist, but also, as Roosevelt said privately, a rich nor poor. If the cards do not come to any man, he said, or if they do come and he has not the power to play them, that is his affair. All I mean is that there shall be no crookedness in the dealing.
Here's what you can expect from your government. You can expect a square deal so that the rich man and the poor man are treated fairly, that there is due process that doesn't favor the rich. Roosevelt's essential view was government needed to redistribute to the lower orders, but it should never align itself with the wealthy and the privileged against common people. At the very least, government needs to be absolutely neutral in the way it treats the citizens of this country.
By late October, a Roosevelt victory seemed so likely that the big financiers who both feared and hated him scurried to write handsome checks for his campaign. Still, he wrote to one of his sons. He worried that he might not be elected president in his own right.
If things go wrong on election night, remember, Kermit, that we are very, very fortunate to have had 3 years in the White House. That I have had a chance to accomplish work such as comes to very, very few men in any generation. And that I have no business to feel downcast merely because when so much has been given me, I have not had even more. Your loving father.
Edith Roosevelt invited a few friends for dinner on election night. A little feast, she called it, which can be turned into a festival of rejoicing by a landslide. He took nearly every state outside the old Democratic Confederacy. Have swept the country, he wired a friend. I had no idea there would be such a sweep. He made the worst blunder of his political career. The Constitution said nothing about how many terms a president might serve, but because to break that precedent. Roosevelt could have argued that he would not really have had 2 full terms, since he had shared his first with the assassinated William McKinley, but he viewed that as a mere technicality. Under no circumstances, he told the press, will I accept another nomination. As he spoke, Edith and his daughter Alice visibly flinched.
Roosevelt decided, flush of victory on election night, that he would was going to silence all of those people who said that he was merely a politician. And he said that he would not run for another term in 1908. Now, this appalled his wife. It appalled all of his supporters. It eventually appalled him.
I would cut my hand off, he told a friend, if I could recall that statement. At the pinnacle of his power, he worried that he had made himself a lame duck. He would do everything he could to make sure that would not happen.
Dear Franklin, we are greatly rejoiced. I was fond of Eleanor as if she were my daughter, and I like you and trust you and believe in you. You and Eleanor are true and brave, and I believe you love each other unselfishly, and golden years open before you. May all good fortune attend you both. Give my love to your dear mother, your affectionate cousin, Theodore Roosevelt.
On December 1st, 1904, less than 3 weeks after Franklin Roosevelt had proudly cast his first presidential vote for his cousin Theodore, he and Eleanor finally announced their engagement, only as a member of the New York Yacht Club, who'd lost an election for class marshal at Harvard. The year of secrecy about their relationship had been hard on both Franklin and Eleanor. They had to meet without arousing the curiosity of friends or relatives or talkative servants, and they could rarely be alone together. I Want You So Much had to be canceled. Franklin's mother made things still more difficult. She promised her son she would love Eleanor and adopt her fully when the right time comes. But meanwhile, she looked for ways to keep them apart. Even took her son on a Caribbean cruise and hoped that he might get over his infatuation. Meanwhile, Eleanor had discovered the rewards of useful work. Like many debutantes of her era, she had volunteered to work with immigrant children in a settlement house. In her case, on Rivington Street on the Lower East Side. Unlike most of her contemporaries, she took her work seriously. She rode public transportation, worked overtime, sometimes turned down invitations rather than miss a class.
She meets with folks who create the Junior League. young women, just like Eleanor Roosevelt, very affluent, born to privilege, who recognize that there is no security for anybody, but there is insecurity and misery for men.
One afternoon, when Franklin dropped by to visit, a little girl fell ill. Eleanor asked him to carry her home. He did, and never forgot the sights and foul smells of the tenement in which she lived. My God, he told Eleanor, I didn't know anyone who lived like that.
I think Eleanor Roosevelt played a very important part in making Franklin see the world beyond the very elegant Harvard world that he had known. And it had an enormous impact on him. And I really think that went on throughout their lives. When he couldn't move beyond his office, she really did become his eyes and ears. She was far, far more than that. But she told him what was really happening in the real world all the time.
She loved her work, found fulfillment in helping others that she never found elsewhere. But she was willing to give up that work and the independent life it promised for marriage, hoping to find in her husband a confidant and to find in his mother something like the loving mother she had never had. It was a bargain she would often regret.
Each wanted from a relationship something that the other couldn't quite give. She wanted an intimate, someone she could confide in, a husband who was always supportive and always there for her, someone who had all the devotion to him that his mother had, be worshipful and had to be admonitory.
On March 4th, 1905, the president invited the newly engaged couple to his inauguration.
Franklin and I went to our seats on the Capitol steps, just back of Uncle Ted and his family. I was interested and excited, but politics still meant little to me. Oh, I can remember the forceful manner in which Uncle Ted delivered his speech. I told myself I had seen racial in the family.
Franklin never took his eyes off the president. 13 days later, on March 17th, President Roosevelt was to lead the St. Patrick's Day parade up Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt chose that day to marry in a cousin's parlor on East 76th Street so that the president could be there to give his late brother's daughter away.
Semblance of a national event. The presence of President Roosevelt, the bride's uncle, Miss Alice Roosevelt, and Mrs. Roosevelt, and, as some rather enthusiastic, if not discreet woman observed, the entire family in every degree of cousinship, made it very much like a royal alliance. The New York Times.
When the Reverend Endicott Peabody of Groton asked, "Who giveth this woman in marriage?" the president shouted back, "I do." His oldest daughter, Alice, that father always wanted to be the every funeral and the baby at every christening. As soon as Franklin and Eleanor exchanged their vows, he slapped the groom on the back. "Well, Franklin," he said, "there's nothing like keeping the name in the family." Then he hurried into the room where refreshments were served and held forth for an hour and a half. The newlyweds were largely overlooked. Franklin and Eleanor's honeymoon would last more than 3 months. He assured his mother he and Eleanor were having a scrumptious time, but there were private hints of strain. Franklin sleepwalked, suffered nightmares, developed persistent hives. Eleanor grew jealous when she chose not to active New York milliner who happened to be staying at their hotel. But everywhere they went, Franklin told his mother, President Roosevelt had just succeeded at something no other statesman had dared attempt. Helping to end it, Russia had found itself on the losing end. Most of the Tsar's fleet in the Battle of Tsushima. For the first time in centuries, an Asian power had defeated a Western one. But its victories had been won at a fearful cost.
Roosevelt believed that the United States needed to assert itself and say, we're a player. We're not that isolationist nation across the Atlantic. We're part of this story now, and we're going to assert ourselves. He decides it would be ruinous for the future of the planet if either side won decisively, won outright, and devastated Russia. This would lead to a destabilization of the Pacific. And so he wanted to settle this before it got too far out of hand.
In August of 1905, President
I think you could probably do that. Make sure that's oh, that's for shot.
was able to persuade both sides to agree to send representatives to a conference near Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Before talks began, he invited them aboard the presidential yacht in Oyster Bay, provided a stand-up lunch so that no one could claim he'd been slighted by the seating arrangements, and proposed a toast to which he insisted there be no responses, that a just and lasting peace may speedily be concluded. Then he worked behind the scenes to hammer out an agreement to Korea. Japan dropped its demand for payment for the costs of the war. The disputed island of Sakhalin was split in two.
This is splendid. This is magnificent. This is a mighty good thing for Russia, a mighty good thing for Japan, and mighty good for me, too.
Roosevelt's friend and frequent critic Henry Adams declared him the best herder of emperors since Napoleon. For his efforts, Roosevelt was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, the first American to win any Nobel Prize. But the president remained a realist about the prospects for a permanent peace in the Pacific.
Sooner or later, the Japanese will try to bolster up their power by another war. Fortunately for us, we have what they want most, the Philippines. When it comes, we will win over Japan. But it will be one of the most disastrous conflicts the world has ever seen. Oyster Bay, August 26th, 1905. Dear Kermit, the other day a reporter asked Quentin something about me, to which that affable and canny young gentleman responded, "Yes, I see him sometimes. I know nothing of his family life."
The country was as obsessed with Roosevelt's family as it was with him. Sagamore Hill still provided some privacy. Roosevelt cousins gathered there during the summer, sometimes 14 at a time. The president led them on what he called point-to-point walks, long, strenuous dashes through woods and marshes, pushing through brambles, and never, ever going around anything.
He didn't tell his children, especially his sons, that they needed to live up to his example. But everything that he did indicated that people who didn't live up to that kind of example were somehow lesser individuals. And the sons couldn't.
Was an 18-year-old Harvard freshman. His father had pushed him so hard when he was small that Edith and the physician had to intervene. He remained a regular bull terrier, his proud father wrote, stoical enough to have finished a Groton football game despite a broken collarbone. 16-year-old Kermit was shy, bookish, moody, a student at Groton who sometimes suffered from the family curse of depression. But the White House was still home to both were quiet and sweet-tempered. 7-year-old Quentin was sweet-tempered too, but he was also mischievous and irrepressible, a fine little bad boy, according to his mother, fond of big words that he bit off just as his father did, and accustomed to giving orders to the band of small boys that called themselves the White House Gang. His father's nickname for him was Quentin. The children's pets were allowed to roam everywhere. Rabbits, raccoons, cats, dogs. A badger named Josiah that their father described as looking like a mattress with legs. It bit only legs, Archie assured nervous visitors, not faces. They smuggled a pony into the White House elevator and up to the second floor, rolled giant snowballs down the White House roof and onto the heads of policemen, spattered Gilbert Stuart's portrait of George Washington with spitballs, and used mirrors.
Lord, why should he? They are not in the least congenial. And if I don't care over much for him and don't take a bit of interest in the things he likes, why should he pay any attention to me or the things I live for? Except to look on them with disapproval. Alice Roosevelt.
Alice was 21. To him, he could not bear to speak her name. Her early life had been divided among her mother's parents, her Aunt Bammy, and her father and stepmother at Sagamore Hill. Like her cousin Eleanor, she felt she had never had a real home of her own.
She always felt like the fifth wheel. She felt that for some reason or other TR resisted her. And so there's a sort of tension in their relationship. Alice had some of that mighty Rooseveltian energy. But for a woman in this period, there were so few avenues to release that energy in a socially useful way. So she was straitjacketed by the mores of her time.
Edith and Theodore had urged her to remain ladylike, tractable, reserved, to behave the way Eleanor did. Instead, Alice set out to be conspicuous. She had been the first teenage girl to grow up in the White House in a quarter of a century, was attractive, outspoken, desperate to be noticed. She did everything, or almost everything, a young woman of her age and standing should not have done. She smoked, she bet on the horses, took long, unchaperoned automobile rides in a bright red roadster, flirted with battalions of wealthy young men in New York and Newport, and wore a green snake as a wriggling fashion accessory to divert attention during one of her father's meetings with the press. Her face was everywhere. Candy boxes, song sheets, the front pages of newspapers around the world. The German Navy named a ship for her. Overseas crowds hailed her as Princess Alice.
The family was always telling me, beware of publicity. And there was publicity hitting me in the face every day. And once stories got out, or were invented, I was accused of courting publicity. I destroyed a savage letter on the subject from my father. There was he, one of the greatest experts in publicity there ever was, accusing me of trying to steal his limelight.
Alice Roosevelt would remain a thorn in the side of one Roosevelt or another for decades.
The Washington Post. It is nations of all parties that Roosevelt has more political acumen in one roll of his brain than the whole militant tribe of American politicians have in their combined intelligence. That his political perception, so acute as to amount almost to divination, is superior to that of any American statesman of the present or immediate past era.
In June of 1906, Theodore Roosevelt seemed almost invincible. In his most recent message to Congress, he had called for a series of national solutions to national problems, righting wrongs through progressive legislation. The country was changing, and the troublesome conscience he had inherited from his father would not let him ignore those injustices.
Roosevelt realized that we were no longer a rural people. We were an urban people. He realized that industry was out of control. So when he looked at this, he thought, well, what can we do to make sure that all Americans can thrive? So he was essentially trying to do what Jefferson was trying to do in the Declaration of Independence. But he looked and he realizes that in order to achieve a Jeffersonian nation, you have to adopt Hamiltonian means. And so progressivism is using government to thrive, even if they don't have the advantages of the Jeffersons, the Madisons, the Lincolns. Country has to work for everyone, or it doesn't work for anyone in Roosevelt's mind.
Now, over the furious objections of the railroads and the powerful Republican senators they controlled, Roosevelt won passage of the Hepburn Act. It empowered the Interstate Commerce Commission to limit the rates the railroads could charge to move goods from place to place. And for the first time in American history, gave the rulings of a federal agency the force of law. Let me tell you, Roosevelt's great accomplishment was the Hepburn Act. But it was a big deal at that time because he not only favored federal regulation of freight rates, he did something no one had ever done before. Campaign as president around the country for a piece of legislation. That was a shocking expansion of the pretenses of the presidency. Employing his skill to outthink and outmaneuver the opposition behind the scenes, and his uncanny ability to rally the people to his cause, he pushed through more bills that began to rewrite the role of government in American life. With indirect help from crusading journalists, he championed the Pure Food and Drug Act, which demanded that the producers of everything from patent medicines to canned tomatoes act. When the Meatpacking Trust tried to block an inspection bill that would have cleaned up their appalling slaughterhouses, Roosevelt released part of the findings of a federal investigation into industry practices, and then threatened to make public the rest if they didn't back down. They did.
I attack iniquities. I try to choose the time for an attack when I can get the bulk of the people to accept the principles for which I stand.
Roosevelt enraged those whom he denounced as malefactors of great wealth, especially those who had contributed to his 1904 campaign in hopes of having some control over his policies. "We bought the son of a bitch," one said, but he wouldn't stay long.
Theodore Roosevelt understood the enormous energies
Really?
and he saw that among the things that would devour these forces if not contained would be some of the irreplaceable beauties of the country.
The Antiquities Act Roosevelt had also signed in June of 1906 empowered the president to provide protection from prehistoric ruins as well as objects of scientific interest on federal lands, without having to ask permission of the Congress. He immediately reinterpreted the act so that he could also save as national monuments some of the country's most extraordinary natural wonders, including Devil's Tower and the Muir Woods, Mount Olympus, and more than 800,000 acres of the grandest canyon on Earth. Before Theodore Roosevelt left office, and over the objections of the Speaker of the House, Joseph G. Cannon, who liked to say, not 1 cent for scenery, he would create 51 bird sanctuaries, 4 national game refuges, and 18 national monuments. He doubled the number of national parks from 5 to 10, saving Western landscapes like those where he had first learned that ceaseless action could defeat despair. He helped save the buffalo too, the animal he had once loved to shoot, from extinction. He set aside more than 280,000 square miles of federal land under one kind of conservation protection or another, an area larger than the state of Texas, and created the United States Forest Service to see that the development of natural resources be done in a responsible, sustainable way.
Surely our people do not understand even yet the rich heritage that is theirs. There can be nothing more beautiful than the Yosemite, groves of giant sequoias and redwoods, the canyon of the Colorado, the canyon of the Yellowstone, the Tetons. Our children should see to it that they are preserved for their children, and their children's children forever with their majestic beauty unmarred. We are not building this country of ours for a day, to last through the ages.
Office of the Mayor, Brownsville, Texas. Dear Mr. President, at a few minutes before midnight on Monday, August 13th, 1906, a body of soldiers of the 1st Battalion of the 25th United States Infantry, colored, numbering between 20 to 30 men, began firing in town, directly into dwellings, offices, stores, and at police and citizens. Our women and children are terrorized.
Back in August of 1906, President Roosevelt had ordered the War Department Inspector General, a white South Carolinian, to investigate charges related to an alleged rampage in Brownsville, Texas by black troops that had left a white bartender dead and a police officer wounded. The Army was totally segregated then, and the soldiers had been abused and insulted by whites ever since they'd arrived in Brownsville just 3 weeks earlier. The soldiers denied any wrongdoing. The regiment's white commanding officer backed them up. A Texas grand jury failed to indict any of the soldiers. Race relations had not improved since Roosevelt invited Booker T. Washington to dinner at the White House in 1901. More than 400 black men and women had been lynched since then. Black voters were still barred from the polls throughout the South. And a new generation of African Americans was growing impatient with Booker T. Washington's caution and his coziness with Roosevelt. The president had made a few symbolic gestures toward civil rights. He denounced the lawlessness of lynching, and when whites in Indianola, Mississippi, forced his black appointee as postmistress to resign, he closed the post office and made them travel 20 miles to get their mail. But he also made much of his Confederate ancestry whenever he was in the South, and privately said it would take black people many thousands of years to match the intellectual powers of white people. The Inspector General's report on the Brownsville incident recommended that the president should dismiss all of the.
Booker T. Washington wrote to him and said, "Please, Mr. President, I will not criticize you publicly. You are my dear friend. But I ask you to reopen this case and look again." He refused, and he got more and more righteous and shrill about it. This is without question the most dishonorable moment of Roosevelt's long and extraordinary career.
Roosevelt, thousands of blacks cast their votes for his party's congressional candidates all across the North, and then dismissed all 167 men from the service. One had fought alongside TR in Cuba. That sergeant remembered splitting his rations with Roosevelt himself after the Battle of Las Guasimas. None of the men would get a penny in pension. Some black intellectuals, including W.E.B. Du Bois, began to suggest that African Americans now abandon the party of Abraham Lincoln for the Democrats. But when the time came to write his autobiography, he chose to make no mention of the case.
The Christmas present to Franklin and Eleanor from Mom. Number and straight up quite the other side. 19 or 20 feet.
In the winter of 1908, Franklin and Eleanor moved into the 6-story New York townhouse his mother had built for them at 49 East 65th Street. With them came their first 2 children, 2-year-old Anna and 11-month-old James, as well as Eleanor's younger brother Hall and 6 servants. Sarah and 3 more servants occupied the house's twin at number 47. The Roosevelt family crest was carved above the common entrance, and open doors on 3 floors connected the households. Sarah had hired the staff. She and her son had also overseen the construction and furnishings. Eleanor had played almost no part. Not long after they moved in, Franklin found her weeping. He asked what was wrong.
The Los Angeles City Council is expanding protection for renters. Council voted unanimously yesterday to establish a minimum threshold for evicting tenants who fall behind on rent. It also would bar landlords from evicting tenants unless there's unpaid rent from long-standing COVID-19 anti-eviction rules, which will expire on January 31st. Officials in Mexico say a public defender from Orange County died from a drunken fall. The family says that doesn't make sense.
I said I did not like to live in a house which was not in any way mine, one that I had done nothing about, and which did not represent the way I wanted to live. Being an eminently reasonable person, he thought I was quite mad and told me so gently. Said I would feel different in a little while and left me alone until I should become calmer.
Eleanor did calm down, she recalled, but her outburst was the first sign that in the interest of her marriage, she had simply been absorbing the personalities of those around me and letting their tastes and interests dominate me, and that she resented it. Franklin delighted in his children. Eleanor seemed mostly puzzled by them. I had never had any interest in dolls or in little children, she remembered, and I knew absolutely nothing about handling or feeding a baby. Nannies hired and fired by her mother-in-law saw to such details. Brother fell out of his chair this morning, she noted one day. Anna did not come to breakfast because she said, "No, I won't." This behavior alarmed her. So did the nurses, who told her how to handle it.
In part because she had had such terrible mothering on her own mother being so cold to her, dying when Eleanor was young, but also maybe never accepting Eleanor for who she was. So she had no model to go toward when she had her own children.
Franklin had attended Columbia Law School, passed the New York bar, and with the help of family connections, had gone to work as a clerk first him much. A member of the firm recalled that he tended to dance on the top of the hills and leave to others the hard work on the slopes below. But at the courthouse, he got both credible and incredible. And thanks to Uncle Ted, his wife remembered, he was already interested in politics.
Yoshi, let me out of this.
A few
What was it called? Dog, I don't even fucking know.
months after the Roosevelts moved to 65th Street, Eleanor gave birth to a third child. At 11 pounds, the biggest and most beautiful of all the babies she remembered. They named him Frank. And immediately registered his name at Grot.
Watch.
That July, Eleanor and several servants took the three children to their summer home in Campobello, New Brunswick. Sarah had bought the younger Roosevelts their own cottage on the island, entirely separate from hers. There was no electricity, no telephone. All the cooking had to be done on a coal stove. Eleanor loved it. It was hers. The first real home she had ever known. Weeks went by. It became clear that something was wrong with the new baby's heart.
No, dog.
Doctors were consulted. First on the island, then in Hyde Park. Finally, back in Manhattan.
What's my bro's
No
name?
one seemed able to do anything.
What's my homie's name?
Before 7 a.m., Franklin called my brother. Better come tomorrow. Maybe it's
I just said it, dog. Tell me, I just said it.
Angel sees Franklin at 7:29. Franklin and Eleanor most wondered what Eleanor's mother's heart felt like broken. She so hoped to not leave. Her baby is gone from her. November 2nd. I sat often beside my little grandson. It is hard to give him up. My heart aches for Eleanor.
So how are they going to be able to figure this out?
Franklin Roosevelt Jr. was buried in the Roosevelt family plot at St. James Church in Hyde Park. It seemed cruel, Eleanor wrote, to leave him out there in the cold.
Like you saw it for a fucking year.
I reproached myself very bitterly for having done so little about the care.
Your friend. His name was George.
He had been left too much to the I knew
Within a month of her baby's burial, Eleanor would find herself pregnant again.
Dude, it was perfect.
A man has to take advantage of his opportunities. But the opportunities have to come. There is not war,
or make it bigger.
Great general. There is not the great occasion. You don't have the great statesman. Lincoln had such a time.
Yes. You're like, God damn, I don't want to feel like this. Oh, here. Oh, here. Oh,
Theodore Roosevelt accomplished a great deal during his 7 years as president. The breakup of Northern Securities, the cold strike settlement,
Oh my god, I thought that was
the Panama Canal, the Pure Food and Drug Act, the Hepburn Act, an end to the Russo-Japanese War, millions of wild acres preserved for future generations to enjoy. But he himself was not satisfied. Roosevelt could not class himself as a great president.
Some people thought he was the president. But you don't have to have a war in order to be immortalized as a great president. He's shown that, he proved that.
Now, hampered by his own and Secretary of War, William Howard Taft of Ohio, who promised to remain true to the progressive principles Theodore Roosevelt had laid.
At the side of the road, the Rabbi woke up to discover that the tiger, ox, and mouse all arrived before him. That is why.
Their friendship went a long way back, and they were both civil service reformers. They spent so much time together that Corinne, Theodore's sister, said that they seemed to love each other. TR ran his campaign. He told him advice at every moment. He edited his speeches. He said he was as nervous about Taft's campaign as he was about his own. And he was thrilled when Taft won.
Aren't you gonna be
He thought that
this?
this meaningful person who
So
seemed
it's
to
gonna note
share
that
his values and his progressive ideals would make the perfect president
I'm
to
going to
put into law all the things that he had then put out
who
there
did you
as
know
executive
better?
orders. But it didn't work out.
And that's argument.
Friend assured him he had not finished with politics. He said, "My dear fellow, for heaven's sake, don't talk about my having a future. My future is in the past." He was just 50 years old.
What's his dad's name? Georges?
The hunter who wanders through those lands sees sights which ever after remain fixed in his mind. Giraffe on the treetops, near an awesome. Zebras barking in the moonlight as the laden caravan passes on its night march through a thirsty land. Is of the lion's charge, the great bulk of the elephant, close at hand in the somber woodland.
Maybe they come off and follow that. I think I introduced
The rhinoceros. But there are no words that can tell the hidden spirit of the wilderness. That can reveal its mystery, its melancholy, and its charm.
All his life, Roosevelt had dreamed of hunting.
in the dark.
On the next step, when we come back, I want to get into some amazing things to do in the Southland to celebrate
So,
the
cow. That's very good. Why?
Not be tempted to answer reporters' questions about
When he
how
does
his
a real
successor
show,
was
a big
doing.
show, it'll be lots of
On that subject, he promised to be as silent as an oyster.
It's a very good fun.
When he sailed for British East Africa, J.P. Morgan was supposed to have said, "Every American hopes that every lion will do its duty."
Spoken word.
The Roosevelt Safari reminded onlookers of a military campaign.
Perhaps.
A vast American flag flew over the ex-president, a growing collection of specimens.
What if you have an alliterated
206 porters carried supplies, including cans of California peaches and Boston baked beans, 90 pounds of jams, 4 tons of salt to cure animal skins,
a kid who
and
nobody
60
likes?
miniature
I'm a
volumes ranging from Alice in Wonderland to the Federalist
That doesn't
Papers.
rhyme. Shunned.
His tent was cared for by 2 men. 2 more saw to his horses. Another pair was responsible for his guns and ammunition.
Shunned. Stun.
For good luck on the hunt, the president carried a gold-mounted rabbit's foot, given to him by his friend,
Sunny.
the former
Okay, I'm a really
heavyweight
good-looking
champion,
kid.
John L. Sullivan.
Sunny. Sunny.
He
Sunny.
didn't need it.
What rank was Sunny? Sunny?
Together, his and
Stunning
Kermit's
no
rifles
money
accounted
stuff.
for
You can't rhyme
512
something and
animals
have it
and
start
large
the same
birds,
letter. Can
including
you?
20 rhinoceroses,
Shish kebab.
17 lions, 11 elephants,
Yeah.
and 9 giraffes,
Let's try it.
and not including countless smaller birds felled by their shotguns.
No, you can try it.
They kept only a dozen trophies for themselves, Roosevelt said, and shot nothing that was not used either as a museum specimen or for meat. The expedition would eventually send home crates and barrels containing 11,397 preserved creatures.
Sick.
Roosevelt was away from Edith and the rest of his family for 11 months.
Oh, sweetest of all sweet girls.
Sicking.
Last night I dreamed that I was with you.
Sicking.
But our separation was but a dream.
Is sicking and sticking rhyme?
Yeah. I've made the real happiness of my life. Do you remember? Such a pretty engaged girl.
So,
Said you
suck,
loved
just
no, Theodore,
sucking.
that I cannot allow. Darling, I love you so.
Boy, this is a hard
Very happy with me.
pun. Make a pun. What is an alliteration?
Your own lover, Theodore.
In March of 1910, Edith and Theodore were finally reunited at Khartoum and began a 3-month parade across North Africa and Europe, making headlines wherever he went. He hurried Edith through the Louvre, refusing to look at Rubens' nudes because he thought them not suitable for mixed company. Near Berlin, everywhere, crowds cheered him as if he still held office.
Father is so tired that whenever we go in a motor, he falls asleep. The people are
Okay, I'm
quite
gonna have
mad
words
about
that are
him
more-
and stand around the hotel to see him go in and out.
It sounds like it should be possibly allowed for
I
different
had
number
to
of
send
syllables.
him out on
But I
a
can't find any
balcony
good examples. Is it
before
actually
they were
possible English?
dismissed.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't react my head. In parchment.
King Edward II of the United States at the London funeral.
One called head rhyme as opposed to two. It's easy to good rhyming.
He spent so much time with royalty
Democrat
that week, he said, that
and
he felt that
diplomat.
if I met another king,
Caribou
I
and
should bite
kangaroo
him.
and kinkajou.
No one followed Theodore
Okay, so-
Roosevelt's travel,
Democrat.
but other members of the Roosevelt clan harbored similar ambitions. Theodore Roosevelt Jr. was just 20 years old, still too young to run for office, but already being called the Crown Prince in the newspapers. His 3 younger brothers might choose to run for national office someday as well.
Okay, so those would be
When the Democratic
Single
Dutchess
syllable
County District
homophones.
Attorney dropped by Franklin's
Phrase,
law office
phrase,
and asked
painting.
if he'd be interested in running for the state legislature, he jumped at the chance. It was, after all, the party of his beloved late father, the personable young man.
Listened to all Franklin's plans with a great deal of interest.
versus who?
Never occurred to me that I had a part to play. I decided to do. I was
Okay, so-
having a baby.
I like
At the
that.
time,
Cash
at least
flash.
that was my only mission in life.
It's like a heavyweight
Her
boxing.
husband always lived
Should
his
just
own
be called
life
Cash
exactly
Flash.
as he wanted it to.
Really?
Only one
The
thing
biggest
held
cash flash
Franklin
of
back.
them all.
He was
The
worried that
biggest
his
cash
cousin
flash of them
Theodore
all.
might object to a member of the
No, dog.
family running for office on the Democratic ticket.
Oh, dog. Oh my god, I was so ridiculous.
On the morning of June 18, 1910, Theodore Roosevelt finally arrived home into New York Harbor
Love in the heart.
aboard the German passenger ship
You wanna know what
Kaiserin
love in the heartland is
August
like?
Victoria.
It's
The
for
cutter Manhattan drew up
oh,
alongside,
no, it's a what?
prepared to take the Roosevelts ashore. Among the newspapermen, old friends, and family members on her top deck were Franklin and Eleanor.
Want to get your dick sucked?
At some point during the day's festivities, Franklin asked his cousin for his blessing. Theodore gave him the go-ahead. It was to battle the bosses in whatever party he chose. A million New Yorkers were waiting to welcome him home, including scores of reporters eager to ask him what he thought of President Taft and whether he would ever consider running for the White House again himself. He deflected every question. But there was no way Theodore Roosevelt could stay out of public life for long.
It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, where the doer of deeds could have done them better. Credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust, and sweat, and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, with the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who with the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat. Theodore Roosevelt.
Tomorrow night on the Roosevelts, Theodore aims to return to the White House.
He left power too soon. He had to be in the arena.
And charts a deadly course into the Amazon.
We started down the river of doubt, into the unknown.
While Eleanor and Franklin are rocked by betrayal.
Eleanor Roosevelt never forgave or forgot what he had done.
Part 3 of the Roosevelts, an intimate history, tomorrow night.
Tuesday, September 23rd on PBS. American Masters presents the book.
People of my generation were in a hurry to be the first of everything.
The new theory of consciousness.
Sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
I never set up to talk to anybody. Women's liberation.
Invented the personal computer.
To participate in space flight.
We thought we could mold the world. Anything was possible.
Meet these and other movies who made
Yes, please.
the Boomer List.
All right, okay.
On American Masters, Tuesday, September 23rd, only on PBS.
To learn more about the rich history and legacy of one of the most influential families in American history, go to pbs.org/The Roosevelts. The Roosevelts, An Intimate History, is available on Blu-ray and DVD. The companion book is also available. To order, visit shoppbs.org or call 1-800-PLAY-PBS. Also available for download from iTunes.
Shamrock felt like she's doing shit. Shamrock felt like you lazy cunt.
Your festival is happening tomorrow, 11 a.m. to 4 a.m. Heralding the year of the rabbit with traditional lion dance, storytelling.
Was your favorite Rockefeller, Sharon Rockefeller? Sean.
Previously on the Roosevelts.
I have always been fond of the old West African proverb, speak softly and carry a big stick, and you will go far.
America's youngest president charged ahead.
The Panama Canal is one of the great achievements of the human race.
And after a secret courtship, the celebrated marriage of Eleanor and Franklin.
My one great wish is always to prove worthy of it.
And now, part 3 of the Roosevelts, an intimate history.
Dignitary from local groups from 1 to 4 p.m. and that's on January 28th. And the parade route is going to be from Hill at Wall Street to
In the early autumn of 1910, voters living along the back roads of upstate Dutchess County, New York, were startled by something altogether new. A bright red 2-cylinder Maxwell touring car draped with bunting. The car's owner, a Poughkeepsie piano tuner, was behind the wheel. Next to him was an eager young candidate for the state senate, Franklin Delano Roosevelt of Hyde Park.
When he entered politics, everything was new to him. And especially new was dealing on a more or less equal basis with ordinary people. And he loved it. I don't think he ever lost the sense that he was a bit apart from everyone else. But he loved seeing how much like an ordinary person he could be. And I think he really did that all his life.
He was a 28-year-old lawyer who had never run for anything before, and he was a Democrat, running in a traditionally Republican district. But he was also the 5th cousin of the most popular man in America, the ex-president of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt. Young Roosevelt had promised a strenuous campaign. It proved so strenuous that he professed to be delighted by everything, just as his cousin always was. "I'm not Teddy," he liked to tell the crowds. A little shaver said to me the other day that he knew I wasn't Teddy. I asked him why, and he replied, "Because you don't show your teeth." But he did.
He was always to a topic of politics when he met a party. He would approach them as a friend and would lead up to that with that smile of his. Tom Leonard.
Republicans nationally. Democrats captured the House for the first time in 16 years. And as Franklin's proud mother kept a tally of her boy's triumph, the Democratic tide helped sweep him into the New York State Senate.
Yo, dog.
He was on his way.
Cat. Look at this cat.
2 weeks after his party's spectacular defeat at the polls, Theodore Roosevelt traveled to Washington to make a speech. He stopped by the White House for the first time since leaving it 1.5 years earlier. President William Howard Taft and his wife were out of town. For a piece of the corner of the old tennis court, he strode across the room and sat down in the president's chair. It seemed very natural to be sitting there, he said.
Roosevelt had a natural capacity to lead in every avenue of life. He could lead men up San Juan Hill. He could lead men on a posse in the Badlands. And the greatest mistake that he ever made was to relinquish power when he had it. And leaving at the height of his powers as the youngest former president was a ruinously ludicrous thing for him to do. He never could live happily on the periphery of anything. He had to be in the arena. He left power too soon.
During the next 10 years, Franklin Roosevelt would first follow the political trail his hero, Theodore Roosevelt, had pioneered. Then he would deviate dramatically from it, and finally find himself torn among political and family and personal loyalties that threatened to destroy what seemed at first to be a charmed career. Eleanor Roosevelt would struggle to find a place for herself in her own growing family, suffer a betrayal that threatened to shatter forever her fragile sense of self. to try to run for the presidency again, but now he had begun to change his mind. That the intimate connection between the Roosevelts of Hyde Park and the Roosevelts of Oyster Bay would begin to fray.
January 17th, 1911. Senator Franklin Roosevelt is less than 30. He is tall and lithe. With his handsome face and his form of supple strength, he could make a fortune on the stage and determination that now are sending shivers down the spine of Tammany's striped mascot. The New York Times.
Franklin Roosevelt's debut in Theodore Roosevelt had made his reputation by embarrassing the bosses of his own Republican Party. Franklin lost no time in taking on the New York City Democratic machine, Tammany Hall.
FDR did everything he could think of to make himself seem like TR in Albany. Politicians in Albany couldn't stand him.
When the political boss of the Bowery saw Franklin's name, if we've caught a Roosevelt, we'd better take him down and drop him off the docks. The Roosevelts run true to form. Meanwhile, a seat in the United States Senate for New York had opened up. In those days, U.S. senators were still chosen by their state legislatures. The Democrats were in control in New York, and their boss, Charles Murphy, had already made his choice. A Buffalo millionaire named Billy Sheehan, personally charming, privately corrupt. The outnumbered Republicans had agreed not to put up a fight. But a band of 21 reform-minded Democrats, and because he alone was wealthy enough to rent a house in Albany, the rebels met in its library each morning, producing so much blue cigar smoke that the press found the idea of a new Roosevelt repeat. Beating his celebrated cousin's Albany battles irresistible. It's the most humanly interesting political fight for many years, wrote the Albany String Ball as a noxious weed, its members as hopelessly stupid and beasts of prey. Tammany spokesman responded.
Yes. Going live. There you go. Yeah. Love it.
Snob, a secret Republican, anti-Catholic. There's nothing the matter with Sheehan, Manhattan Assemblyman Alfred E. Smith said, except he's an Irishman. The stalemate dragged on for 2.5 months. It might have gone on even longer if a fire hadn't gutted the state capitol building, requiring the weary and impatient Democrats to caucus in cramped quarters across the street. Finally, the Tammany boss named a new candidate, an Irish-American judge every bit as pliant as Sheehan. Roosevelt and the remaining insurgents gave in, then worked hard to make a defeat seem like a victory.
I've just returned from a big fight, a fight that went 64 rounds. And there was fighting every second of those 64 rounds. The other side got good and battered. The battle ended in harmony, and we have chosen a man for the people who will be dictated to by no one.
We are all really proud of the way you have handled yourself, Theodore Roosevelt told Franklin. Good luck to you.
Here in Albany began a dual existence for me, which was to last all the rest of my life. Public service, whether my husband was in or out of office, was to be part of our daily life from now on.
Eleanor was fascinated by the Sheehan battle and pleased at her own ability to function apart from her mother-in-law in a wholly new world. She organized a reception for 250 constituents, supplied food and drink every evening for Franklin and his fellow insurgents, and got to know all kinds of people, including a number of politicians who were unable to resist her, but couldn't stand her husband because he seemed so unreliable. Franklin Roosevelt battled hard for a direct primary that would have allowed voters, not bosses, to choose their senators, but then backed away at the last minute from a reform charter for New York City. After a fire at the Triangle Shirtwaist Company killed 146 women, a special commission produced a flood of 32 reform bills. Roosevelt voted for all of them, but when the most hotly contested vote came, on a bill setting a 50-hour-per-week work limit for women and children, he didn't bother to show up for the debate. He was a very uncertain factor, one reformer remembered. No one could ever tell how he was going to vote. And throughout, he maintained an earnest, pious air, compounded by what one observer remembered as the unfortunate habit, so natural that he was unaware of it, of throwing his head up, which combined with his great height, gave him the appearance of looking down his nose at most people.
And that famous image we have of him with his chin up, you know, that great pose of confidence, chin up. At that time, it was his nose in the air.
Awful, arrogant fellow, that Roosevelt, Big Tim Sullivan, award boss, said. Looking back many years later, Franklin himself into politics.
If they treated Theodore as they deal with certain composite substances in chemistry, and melted him down to his ultimate central indestructible stuff, it's not a statesman they find, or a hunter, or a historian, or a naturalist. They find a preacher militant, going Wister.
On February 24th, 1912, Theodore Roosevelt announced that he was once again a candidate for
Throw the ball. Throw it, dog. You suck. Why? They're like, dude, who even is your fucking program?
To the United States. My hat is in the ring, he said.
Philadelphia.
The fight is on, and I am stripped to the buff.
Really?
He had been restless ever since
this
his...
is us. Didn't lose last week. Bad bye. Why? Because the wild card weekend.
President Taft's appointment to many progressives and to Roosevelt. Amiable, well-meaning, and enormous. He weighed well over 330 pounds. Taft backed away from meaningful tariff reform, retreated in the face of timber and mining interests eager to get at national forests, refused to intervene in legislative matters on the grounds that it would violate the constitutional doctrine of separation of powers. Actions he had taken.
Taft had succeeded at everything he had done up to that point. He'd been Roosevelt's Secretary of War. He'd been a successful judge. He'd been Governor General of the Philippines.
You gotta feel like
and he was a lovely person to have around. Everyone loved Will Taft.
He doesn't even
Roosevelt.
Roosevelt now thought Taft.
We watching, baby. I love it.
Utterly.
emergency contraception fund based in Los Angeles. Riverside, there is a march or a rally that is happening at 11 a.m. outside.
Helpless as a leader. He felt both personally
taking place at 11 a.m. That already
politically betrayed. In a celebrated speech at Osawatomie, Kansas, he called for a new nationalism. Social justice in America, he said, could only be achieved through a strong federal government and a president who saw it as his duty to act as the steward of the public interest. But William Howard Taft's Republican Party did not see things that way. Of strong state parties. Those state parties controlled their state legislatures, which were in turn controlled by the interests.
I do want to hear what is happening with the Broward CFI News with my brother Mark.
Banks in New York, timber in Michigan.
The California State Employment Development Department reporting the seasonally adjusted unemployment rate for December was 4.7%, down from November's rate of 4.8%. White House Chief of Staff Ron Klain is expected to depart the Biden administration in the coming weeks, according to two sources familiar with the decision. 50 games for Sportsnet LA, and will be the only Asian American sportscaster working for a Major League Baseball team. We're going to check out a rough patch on the 5. That's right after this. Someone uses your toilet. And founder of Rooter Hero Plumbing. Your host.
Damn, 38 points is the record.
In Montana and railroad.
A man who wrongly holds that every human right is second to his profit must now give way to the advocate of human welfare. Who rightly maintains that every man holds his property subject to the general right of the community to regulate its use, to whatever degree the public welfare may require it.
She would.
On the left, row winter playground for the whole family. Let's be downtown with angels and a giant snowman appearing in the dress. Don't miss their winter wonderland at the Palm Springs area tramway.
Her husband's return to presidential politics. She was sure the old guard would deny him the Republican nomination, she said, and could see no possible result which could give me aught but keen regret. Roosevelt's old friend, Massachusetts Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, also begged him to stay out of it. But Roosevelt was determined to run. 7 out of 19 Republican governors promised their support. Ohio Congressman Nick Longworth, who had married TR's rebellious daughter Alice, said that at the prospect of a return to action, he suddenly seemed 10 years younger, in such wonderful spirits that he behaved like a boy. State party machines still picked most delegates to the Republican convention, but a dozen states would hold direct primaries that year. If Roosevelt could demonstrate in those that voters overwhelmingly wanted him, he reasoned, the bosses would be unable to resist. The fight went on for almost 4 months. Bitter, damaging, personal. Roosevelt called Taft a puzzlewit, a fathead, disloyal to
He can't believe that his friendship has been destroyed. It's inexpressibly sad. It means more to him to lose the friendship than to lose the presidency.
I don't want to fight, Taft said, but when I do fight, I want to hit hard. Even a rat in a corner will fight. He denounced Roosevelt as a freak, a demagogue, the most dangerous man we have had in this country since its origin. The order came upon an exhausted Taft aboard, the president said, and began to weep. When the primary season ended, Roosevelt had captured 9 states, including Taft's own home state of Ohio. It was clear that most Republican voters wanted change. But just as Edith had predicted, when the party met in the Chicago Coliseum in June, the old guard regulars in charge were immovable. They awarded all but 19 of the 254 contested delegates to Taft. Roosevelt declared he was being robbed and told his followers not to bother sitting through the roll call. They walked out. The parting of the ways has come, Roosevelt said. The Republican Party must stand for the rights of humanity, or else it must stand for special privilege. The next day, he appeared before his supporters.
The victory shall be ours, and it shall be won as we have already won so many victories, by clean and honest fighting for the loftiest of causes. We fight in honorable fashion for the good of mankind, fearless of the future, unheeding of our dimmed eyes. We stand at Armageddon and we battle for the Lord.
They cheered him for 45 minutes. If they wish to form a third party and have him make the fight, he told them, I will make it, even if only one state should support me. Officially, his followers would call themselves the Progressives, after the social policies they and he had championed. But because their candidate had told a reporter he felt as strong as a bull moose, they would be remembered as the Bull Moose Party. Many of his closest friends thought he was making a terrible.
I don't think you can say it was a mistake, because he would have exploded from unspent energy if he hadn't done it. And there's nothing wrong with every once in a while saying the two parties aren't responsive. Two-party system is an excellent thing. It is not graven on the heart of man by the finger of God. There are occasions when a serious politician will say, there are serious forces in the country that are not being responded to by a kind of political market failure. The third party, Israel, also had a public spirit that caused him to move.
TR, as a student of Lincoln's career, knows that the Republican Party was just invented as this strange third party in 1854. And if you could do that to meet the needs of the 1850s, why couldn't you do it in 1912? Because he said the two main parties are husks. Neither party was really addressing modern industrial issues of a past generation. A third party was needed to bring the crucial issues to the forefront.
Roosevelt's blood was up. He championed positions far more radical than any he had espoused before. Positions that had been put forward for decades by Americans who felt left out. The progressive platform recognized a woman's right to vote and labor's right to organize, promised to curtail campaign spending and defend natural resources, limit the workday to 8 hours and the work week to 6 days, and to provide federal insurance for the elderly, the jobless, and the sick. If judges dared interfere with the new laws, he said, they should be recalled by the voters. When a judge decides a constitutional question, when he decides what the people as a whole can and cannot do, the people should have the right to recall that decision if they think that it is wrong.
He truly had come to believe that the progressive agenda would save this country from a bloody social revolution, the kind that would occur in Russia. This is not political opportunism. He believed that the only way to save capitalist America was to have a social democratic gradualist revolution here, which we call progressivism. This was genuine, mature ideology. But of course, he also wanted back in.
Roosevelt was confident he could beat Taft, but his hope of defeating the Democrats rested on their picking what he called a reactionary. And two of the three leading candidates were just the kind of opponents he'd hoped for. But after 46 exhausting ballots at their convention in Baltimore, the Democrats settled on Woodrow Wilson, the former president of Princeton University and governor of New Jersey. He'd only been in politics 2 years, but he appealed to reformers because he'd beaten his own party machine to pass progressive legislation in his state. From Roosevelt's point of view, Wilson was the worst rampant
and very diligently employed in splitting his party wide open so that we Democrats may get in. Woodrow Wilson.
Dear Franklin, I hope you will be re-elected because I know how honest and fearless you are and that nothing will change when you are honest and right. I hope the bull moves.
For the first time, the 1912 election would divide the Hyde Park Roosevelts from their Oyster Bay cousins. Franklin Roosevelt could not help but admire the battle Theodore Roosevelt was waging. It is indeed a marvelous thing, he told an old friend. But he was already enlisted in the opposing army. Long before the Bull Moose Party was created, he had been a vocal supporter of Woodrow Wilson. Eleanor remained of two minds.
Franklin is well satisfied with Mr. Wilson's nomination, but I wish Franklin could be fighting now for Uncle Ted, for I feel he is in the party of the future.
Anyone else that fall. He was up for re-election to the state senate, but he and Eleanor had both come down with typhoid fever and were confined to their house on East 65th Street. Luck brought him an able stand-in. That fall, the same Red Maxwell that had introduced Franklin Roosevelt to his constituents 2 years earlier prowled Dutchess County again in search of votes. But this time, it was carrying a very different kind of passenger. Louis McHenry Howe was a veteran Albany newspaperman, gruff and diminutive, chain-smoking, and so famously homely, he sometimes called him character.
He was a little, tiny, hideous man. He sort of gloried in being ugly. He smoked like a chimney. It was covered with ashes. He never...
Howe loved politics and political maneuvering, was drawn to power, but knew he could never win it for himself, and saw that the closest he could ever get
was Roosevelt. And he was able to tell Roosevelt when he was wrong. He was really the only person who ever could do that consistently. You're a damn fool, Franklin. Don't think of doing that.
When he met him in 1911, he actually put aside a bottle of sherry and said that he would open it after Roosevelt became president.
And he decided, when no one else in his right mind would have thought so, except possibly Roosevelt, that he should be president of the United States, and he helped make him president of the United States.
He had already begun to address his employer, only partly joking, as beloved and revered future president. Howe crisscrossed Roosevelt's district. He shook hundreds of hands, promised jobs on behalf of the candidate wherever he could, and introduced a shrewd innovation: mimeographed, personalized letters to farmers, fishermen, and apple growers, promising each group special legislation. And he placed newspaper ads denouncing Republican bosses and promising support for women's suffrage.
Dear Mr. Roosevelt, here's your first ad. As I have pledged you in it, I thought you might like to know casually what kind of a mess I was getting you into. Please wire okay if it's all right. your slave and servant. How?
What a miserable showing some of the so-called progressive leaders have made. They represent nothing but sound and fury. The minute they were up against deeds instead of words, they quit forthwith.
From the first, Theodore Roosevelt's third-party campaign was crippled. Many of those who had urged him to challenge Taft, including 5 of the 7 Republican governors, backed off when he became a bull moose. Those who did rally to him were devoted but disorganized, and often amateurish. Taft mostly stayed off the campaign trail, convinced his cause was hopeless. But he issued statements denouncing what he saw as Roosevelt's dangerous radicalism. One who so lightly regards constitutional principles, and especially the independence of the judiciary, was unfit for the presidency, he said, adding, "I say this sorrowfully." Roosevelt and Wilson each traveled the country by train, and TR sometimes delivered 30 whistle-stop speeches a day, shadowboxing through the caboose to maintain his energy before stepping out onto the platform. Again and again, he denounced his Democratic opponent as a secret advocate of states' rights, a false progressive, masquerading as a friend of strong federal government. Both candidates actually agreed with Wilson's view that the president is at liberty in both law and conscience to be as big as he can. And both men lashed out at the giant trusts and monopolies at every stop. But Roosevelt's new nationalism called only for their regulation, while Wilson's new freedom seemed to suggest that he would actually break them up.
I saw President McKinley sit up in his coffin, pointing at a man in monk's attire, in whom I recognized Theodore Roosevelt. The dead president said, "This is my murderer. Avenge my death."
On the evening of October 14th, Theodore Roosevelt was in Milwaukee, standing in his open automobile in front of the Gilpatrick Hotel, waving his hat to the crowd. A delusional German immigrant named John Schrank, standing just 7 feet away, aimed a pistol at his chest.
Single braid, so looking for connection, my life.
And because I had to drop out of high school. It's not a pleasant story. But as I grew older, I also grew up. I realized that my dad didn't leave me alone. He left me with values and principles that continue to shape my life. Dad said be on time. He didn't like it when people were late. He taught me to be polite. It was something I lost, but we captured it.
He had been stalking Roosevelt for a month, convinced the ghost of William McKinley was directing his hand. The bullet passed through the ex-president's spectacles case, and the folded 50-page speech behind an inch from his heart. Roosevelt dabbed at his mouth, found no blood, and concluded his lungs were undamaged. He insisted on delivering his speech despite his wound. "I did not care a rap for being shot," he later told a friend. "It is a trade risk, which every prominent man should accept as a matter of course."
Friends, I shall ask you to be as quiet as possible. I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just...
He showed the crowd his mangled glasses case, unbuttoned his jacket so that they could see his bloody shirt.
Well, it is in me now, but I cannot make a very long speech. I'll try my best.
And now, friends, his whole heart and soul was in this struggle, he said. What we progressives are trying to do is to enroll rich and poor, to stand together for the most elementary rights of good citizenship. Mr. Wilson has distinctly committed himself to the old flintlock muzzle-loaded doctrine. Pale and sometimes swaying at the podium, he went on for more than an hour before his aides could get him to stop and agree to go to the hospital. The news spread fast. Edith Roosevelt heard it while attending the theater in New York. He sent her a telegram urging her to stay home. He'd been far more seriously injured, falling off. Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, still recovering from typhoid, anxiously telephoned the New York Times that evening to get the latest bulletins on his condition. The ex-president's sons hurried to his side. Woodrow Wilson suspended his. Campaign. Even Roosevelt's enemies were impressed by his courage. No one should vote for him simply because he'd been shot. No amount of reflection concentrated in many months could have influenced as many Americans as were stirred by the shock of a madman. He was out of action and under his wife's strict care for almost 2 weeks. This thing about ours being a campaign against boss rule is a fake, Roosevelt joked to a reporter. I was never so boss ruled in my life. The former president made one more campaign appearance in Manhattan. At the sight of him, moving slowly and still unable to raise his right arm, the crowd cheered for 43 minutes. He believed he would win, he told them.
But win or lose, I am glad beyond measure that I am one of the many who in this fight have stood ready to spend and be spent, pledged to fight while life lasts, the great fight for righteousness and for brother. Good, and for the welfare of mankind.
On election day, Roosevelt cast his vote at the Oyster Bay Firehouse, then stood aside as first his chauffeur and then his valet stepped into the same voting booth. He waited for the returns that evening at Sagamore Hill. Roosevelt easily beat Taft, but his entry into the race had ensured a Democratic victory. Woodrow Wilson won the presidency with only 42% of the vote, and his party gained control of both the Senate and the House for the first time in almost 2 decades.
There is no use disguising the fact that the defeat at the polls is overwhelming. I had expected defeat, but I had expected that we would make a better showing. I try not to think of the damage to myself personally.
He's so used to being popular and loved, and then he's suddenly a pariah. Alice used to say that there was a melancholy that ran through the... But he fell into a depression. He just sort of closed himself in, and they had to call a family doctor. They're very concerned about him.
I cannot bear to have father beaten, Edith confided to her diary at Sagamore Hill. It makes me so choky when I think of father almost being assassinated and the people being such cold fishes.
He was brave about it in public and quite sad about it in private. Mrs. Roosevelt wrote one of the children who was away that father spends more time on horseback than...
On the same day Theodore Roosevelt was defeated, Franklin Roosevelt was easily re-elected to the state Senate, Thanks, Lord. Franklin and Eleanor went to Washington for Woodrow Wilson's inauguration, where Josephus Daniels, the new Secretary of the Navy, sought Franklin out, in sailing and the sea. And most important, he bore the country's most famous name. How would you like to come to Washington as Assistant Secretary, Daniels asked. He was offering him Theodore Roosevelt's old job. I'd like it bully well, Franklin said.
Oyster Bay, Marty. I was very much pleased that you were appointed as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. It is interesting to see that you are at another place which I myself once held. I am sure you will enjoy yourself to the full as Assistant Secretary, and that you will do capital work.
New York Democratic Franklin Roosevelt was just 31, the youngest Assistant Secretary of the Navy in history. 7 years younger than Theodore Roosevelt had been when he first sat at the same desk. So young, and so young looking, that a dinner companion who didn't catch his name thought him a naughty little boy. John Boss seemed hopelessly mismatched. The new Assistant Secretary had attended Groton and Harvard, learned to sail aboard his father's yacht, and like his cousin Theodore, believed in a strong defense and a big navy. Josephus Daniels was a newspaper editor from North Carolina, Wilson's Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, who believed strong defenses were a provocation and promised that the United States would never go to war on his watch. Inspection tour, leaving him in charge. There's a Roosevelt on the job today, Franklin told a reporter. You remember what happened the last time a Roosevelt occupied a similar position? What had happened was the Spanish-American War. Eleanor, sensitive to any feeling among her Oyster Bay relatives that she and Franklin might unfairly be exploiting their link with Theodore Roosevelt, was appalled. It was a horrid little remark, she told her husband. Franklin did not apologize. Secretary Daniels had already noted in his diary that Franklin's distinguished cousin TR went from the Navy Department to the presidency. May history repeat itself, Daniels said. Franklin could not have agreed more. He and Eleanor rented Theodore Roosevelt's sister Bammy's home at 1733 N Street. TR had spent the first few nights of his presidency there, and afterwards had walked there, and the press called it the Little White House. It would be Franklin Roosevelt's headquarters for the next several crowded, frenetic years. Eleanor brought to it all the organizational skills she'd learned in Albany, seeing to the needs of her growing household, entertaining her uncle's old friends, getting to know new people from all over the country who might be helpful to her husband's ambitions.
My calls began in the autumn of 1914 under poor auspices. I was speaking in Mayville again. Other babies was coming along. Somehow or other, I made my rounds every afternoon, and from 10 to 30 calls were checked off on my list day after day. Mondays, the wives of the justices of the Supreme Court. Tuesdays, the members of Congress.
Franklin's official duties at the department included procurement, budgets, and overseeing the 65,000 civilians who worked in the Navy Yard. But he was not content with that. I get my fingers into about everything, he said. There's no law against it. Louis Howe guarded the home-like outer office, seeing to details, screening admirals and ordinary visitors with the same brusque air, always making sure the press heard what his boss wanted.
When Franklin was Assistant Secretary, associated with his principal challenge, various people from the social class, and as time goes on, he ends up spending more time with labor ordinary people made something of themselves, he started to realize.
Franklin reveled in the trappings of his new job. 17 guns greeted him whenever he stepped aboard a ship. He affected a Navy cape and designed an official assistant secretary's flag for himself. And whenever he could get away to his summer home on Campobello Island, he liked to come and go by destroyer, guiding the big warship through the Narrows with his own sure hand at the wheel. When it came time for the 10th reunion of his Harvard class, he arranged to have it held on the deck of the USS Palmer.
At lunch on the second day, Franklin made his grand entrance. He had that characteristic way of throwing his head back and saying, "How are you, Jack? How are you, Walter?" I know I had the feeling.
On February 27th, 1914, shortly after midday, we started down the river of doubt into the unknown. The lofty and matted forest rose like a green wall on either hand. The trees were stately and beautiful. The looped and twisted vines hung from them like great ropes.
Venture, an expedition into the Amazon rainforest, in the course of a newly discovered jungle waterway. The expedition's leader was Candido Rondon, Brazilian explorer who had discovered its headwaters and given it its name, Rio de Duvida, the River of Doubt. No one knew where it led. Roosevelt's 24-year-old son, Kermit, a trained engineer, went with him. The depression he'd first experienced as a child had peaked, and like his late Uncle Elliot, he had begun drinking to obliterate it. The expedition was the 55-year-old Theodore Roosevelt's last chance to be aboard. The Roosevelt Party, 22 men and 7 dugout canoes. Flesh-eating piranhas prowled the river. So did 15-foot crocodiles. Protected gear to write articles. Termites ate part of his pit helmet. Rain fell in sheets. Roosevelt noted that everything that didn't rot rusted. The expedition soon ran out of food and found it hard to replenish its supply. The animals they expected to live off were furtive and invisible.
Double trouble.
Unseen Indians of the stalked the party and shot one of the expedition's dogs full of arrows.
They seemed to Largo watch Roosevelt and his men throughout this trip. They would sometimes hear them next to them. They never saw them. They would sometimes come across their villages, even with smoke still rising out of fires that they had just put out. They would sometimes see footprints. Their dogs sensed them all the time. They were always barking at the woods, and they lived in terror.
5 out of 7 dugout canoes were lost in the fast-moving water. New ones had to be carved from hollowed trees and hauled by land around rapids and waterfalls. One man was swept away by a torrent. Roosevelt and Kermit both contracted malaria. Things got steadily worse.
2 of their canoes were trapped in the water, and Roosevelt, being Roosevelt, even though he's already ill with malaria, he charges right into the river to try to free some of these trapped canoes. And he slips and gashes his leg. He immediately knows that he's in trouble. He very quickly develops an infection, and he gets to a point where he can't lift his head off the cot.
The expedition struggled on.
They came to a set of rapids, a series of 6 falls, the final of which was 30 feet. And Colonel Rundown, who had spent half of his life in the rainforest, said, "There's no way we can get through these. We're going to have to leave our canoes and strike out into the rainforest, every man for himself." And Roosevelt couldn't even sit up, much less walk, much less fight his way through this rainforest. And so he calls for his son, and he says, "Get out. I will stay here."
The ex-president of the United States of America intended to swallow a lethal dose of the morphine he always carried with him into the wilderness.
Oh, that game is on,
He did
Yoshi.
not want to be a burden.
Yoshi, that game is on.
It wasn't a decision built of fear. And it wasn't a dramatic thing. It was simply, this is the right thing to do, and I'm going to do it.
But Kermit would not hear of it. He was, after all, a Roosevelt.
He'd end my life. I would only make it more sure that Kermit would not get out. Fry, he would not abandon me, but would insist on bringing my body out too. That, of course, would have been impossible. So, there's only one thing for me to do, and that was to come out myself.
He kept a diary, and every day is, "I'm worried about Father, I'm worried about Father. We have to get Father out."
Kermit's weeks of work hearing skill to lower the dugouts down the steep canyon walls and kept his men moving forward. But there was still more trouble. A porter shot and killed a companion and fled into the forest. A deep gorge and an apparently impassable series of new rapids stretched on ahead. Theodore was helpless now, forced to be paddled along beneath a makeshift tent. His fever rose to 104. He grew delirious, reciting the same few lines of poetry over and over again. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure-dome decree. Under Kermit VI, after a month and a half in the wilderness, they came upon a 6-man relief party that had been sent to help them out of the rainforest.
Here's Roosevelt, so ill, and he looks up and he sees on this bank the Brazilian flag and the flag of the United States of America, and he knows that they're going to be okay, that they're saved.
The River of Doubt, which turned out to be almost half as long as the Rhine, was renamed Rio Roosevelt. New Yorkers gave Roosevelt another big welcome when he returned home. But friends were shocked by his appearance. He had lost 55 pounds, roughly a quarter of his weight, could barely make himself heard when speaking, and leaned on a cane he bravely called my big stick.
As he limped down the companionway, the impression was strong that the colonel had endured the greatest hardships of his life. New York Sun.
It now seemed likely that his public life really had come to an end.
August 1st, 1914. And war trembles in the balance. It is not a good thing for a country to have a professional yodeler, a human trombone like Mr. Bryan as Secretary of State, nor a college president like Mr. Wilson as head of the nation, with a hypocritical ability to deceive plain people and no real knowledge or wisdom concerning internal and international affairs.
In early August of 1914, 5 weeks after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo, Germany declared war on Russia and France and sent troops across the Belgian border. Russia then went to war against the Austro-Hungarian Empire. By the end of the year, Eleanor was at Campobello with the children.
Dear Babs, a complete smash-up is inevitable. Mr. Daniels totally fails to grasp the situation. I'm alive and well and keen about everything, running the real work. Though Josephus is here, he is bewildered by it all. Very sweet, but very sad.
I am not surprised at what you say about Mr. Daniels, for one could expect little else in conflict. One must have at least a glimmering of understanding of foreign nations and their histories.
American armed forces would only serve to provoke the belligerents. The Germans, in retaliation, unleashed submarines and warned they would sink enemy vessels on sight. All of the Roosevelts sided with England and her allies from the moment the first gun was fired. Even I longed to go over into the thick of it and right the wrong, Franklin told an old British friend. England's course has been magnificent. Oh, if that German fleet would only come out. Theodore Roosevelt did not.
More and more, I come to the view that in a really tremendous world struggle, with a great moral issue involved, neutrality does not serve righteousness. For to be neutral between right and wrong is to serve wrong.
In the spring of 1915, as the war intensified, Theodore Roosevelt found himself in a Syracuse courtroom on trial for libel. In a recent speech, he'd said that when it came down to a struggle between popular rights and corrupt and machine-ruled government, the interests of the Republican and Democratic bosses of New York were fundamentally identical. The Republican boss, William Barnes, immediately sued. Roosevelt cast about among old friends and allies for those willing to testify to the truth of his charge. Most backed away, unwilling to risk seeing collusion between the bosses of both parties firsthand. Was more than willing to say so in court on behalf of the man who continued to be his hero. When a lawyer asked Franklin what relation he was to the former president, he grinned. Fifth cousin by blood, he said proudly, and nephew by law. I shall never forget the capital way in which you gave your testimony, the ex-president told Franklin in own defense, that the plaintiff's lawyer begged the judge to make the ex-president confine himself to words and not answer with his when the telephone rang. A newspaper man was calling. A German submarine had sunk the British passenger ship Lusitania off the coast of Ireland. More than 11 citizens. Did Roosevelt have a comment? The trial was still on. 2 German Americans sat on the jury that would decide his fate. But Roosevelt could
represent not merely piracy, but piracy on a vaster scale of murder than the old-time pirates ever practiced. It seems inconceivable that we can refrain from taking into our own national self-respect.
It took the jurors 2 days, but in the end, all 12 of them exonerated.
Wilson and Bryan are cordially supported by all the hyphenated Americans, or the solid flubbed-up, pacifist followers and weakling. Every man who can't look more than 6 inches ahead, every man who's got his money, or pleasure, or ease, is enthusiastically in favor of Wilson. And at present, the good citizens as a whole are puzzled and don't understand the situation.
It was excessive. Quite a Presbyterian moralist just struck
Teddy Roosevelt was, I think, part of the effeminacy that he associated with a commercial republic.
Wilson declared there is such a thing as being too proud to fight, and engaged Germany in a long exchange of diplomatic protests that further infuriated Theodore Roosevelt. But the president also agreed to double. Meanwhile, Franklin organized a 50,000-man naval reserve, relentlessly drove shipyards to greater efforts, and laid the keels of new battleships, including one being built in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, the USS Arizona. He complained again and again about Secretary Daniels being too damn slow for words, and surreptitiously slipped damaging information about his boss and the administration's defense efforts to the ranking Republican on the House Military Affairs Committee. If the public ever turned on the administration for having been too slow in preparing for war, he was determined he would not be blamed. And he shared his cousin Theodore's conviction that the United States not only would, but should get into the war.
Hyde Park was very definitely my most favorite place in life. Hyde Park was home, and the only place I ever thought was completely home. Anna Roosevelt.
Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt had houses in New York City and Washington, D.C., and on Campobello Island. But for their 4 children, Anna, James, Elliot, and the second Franklin Jr., it was their grandmother's home at Hyde Park that represented a sanctuary from their parents' increasingly turbulent world. In 1915, Sarah Delano Roosevelt greatly expanded Springwood to accommodate them and the nurses and maids that traveled with them. The house now included so many bedrooms, she sometimes called it our hotel. The renovated first floor, modeled after the country houses of the Roosevelts' aristocratic friends in England, was meant to be a showcase for her son and his collections. His stuffed birds, his naval prints and books, and albums filled with stamps. When he was there, Franklin acted just as his own father had. He rode with his children, swam and sledded, and took them ice boating on the Hudson. But his visits with the family were always brief.
The holiday had been longer and less interrupted while it lasted. I felt Tuesday as if I was really getting back to earth again. And I know it is hard for us both to lead this kind of life, but it is a little like a drug habit, almost impossible to stop.
Eleanor liked the new Springwood at first. It was very homelike, and for the chicks, she told a friend, ideal. But it remained her mother-in-law's home, she remembered many years later, and I was only a visitor.
Sarah Delano Roosevelt was a very great mother and a very tough mother. She's often portrayed as a dragon. Is that her daughter-in-law in the end came to think of her as a dragon?
Sarah ran everything. She called her grandchildren our children. She weighed them, dressed them, saw to their manners, showered them with gifts, and offered what Anna remembered as consistent, warm, spontaneous love. The kind of love Eleanor had never known when she was a girl, and now found hard to provide to her own children.
Up to a point, it is good for us to know that there are people in the world who will give us love and unquestioned loyalty.
Was he the best friend of all time?
I doubt. However, if it is good for us to feel assured of this devotion, without the accompanying obligation of having to justify this devotion by our behavior.
Sarah had firm views about her daughter-in-law as well. If you just run your comb through your hair, dear, she once told Eleanor in front of dinner guests, you look so much nicer. On March 11, 1916, Eleanor gave birth to John Aspinwall Roosevelt. She had now borne 6 children, 5 of whom had lived. There would be no more. She was 31 years old. The decade during which she said, I was always just getting over a baby or about to have another, was over. She was ready to resume a life of her own, to find a new kind of fulfillment on her own terms. On June 14, 1916, with the nominating conventions just weeks away, President Wilson led a preparedness parade up Pennsylvania Avenue from the Capitol to the White House and made sure that Theodore Roosevelt's young Democratic cousin was marching with him.
The Navy Department made an excellent showing in the parade.
Me in 1916, unless the country has in its mood something of the heroic, unless it feels not only devotion to ideals, but the purpose to realize those ideals in action.
Theodore Roosevelt hoped somehow to obtain both the Progressive and the Republican presidential nominations that year. But the old guard of his old party had not forgiven him for 1912. And while most Americans sympathized with Britain and France and now supported preparedness, they still remained reluctant to get involved in a faraway war. The Republicans chose instead the austere, mildly progressive Supreme Court Justice Charles Evans Hughes. Roosevelt privately called him the Bearded Lady. But when Roosevelt's name was placed in nomination at the Progressive Party convention in June, he sent a telegram from Sagamore Hill declining the honor and urging his followers to abandon their new party and vote Republican. The delegates were stunned.
When the telegram was read, for a moment there was silence. Then there was a roar of rage. It was the cry of a broken heart, such as no convention ever. Tear the Roosevelt picture or the Roosevelt badge from their coats and throw it on the floor. William Allen White.
In November, Wilson won a narrow victory on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." We are passing through a streak of yellow in our national life, Roosevelt told his sister. The Progressive Party disintegrated without its hero. Some members returned to the Republicans. Some became Democrats. A number of the social and economic reforms Roosevelt and the Progressives had championed had already become law, thanks to Woodrow Wilson's shrewd child labor, a Federal Reserve Board, and Federal Trade Commission. But making a reality of other planks.
Another horses reportedly died at Santa Anita. A 4-year-old colt named Press On suffered a training injury at the racetrack. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen says she expects Congress will ultimately vote to raise America's debt limit, but she calls demands by House Republicans for spending cuts in return for backing an increase a very irresponsible thing to do that risks creating self-imposed sanctions after he openly said some military members allowed the January 8th uprising in the Capitol by far-right protesters. We'll tell you about a little flaw in the next one after this. This is the founder service tech is funny, like when our technician David was asked for will help a customer with Parkinson's disease.
The only question for us to decide is whether we shall make war nobly or ignobly.
In Europe, the war on the Western Front dragged on. New machines of war made old tactics obsolete. Millions died. The battle lines had been frozen for nearly 450 miles from Belgium to Switzerland. In early 1917, in an American merchant ships, Wilson severed relations with Germany. Then, an intercepted German telegram to the Mexican president promised that in exchange for help in the event of war with the United States, Texas, Arizona, Wilson still seemed reluctant to take further action. My God, why doesn't he do something, Theodore Roosevelt said. If he does not go to war with Germany now, I shall skin him alive.
I think he felt that Woodrow Wilson flinching from a great test of our time for us. This is a sign of Mr. Roosevelt's
Second inauguration. Franklin met secretly in a private room at the Metropolitan Club in Manhattan with 9 of the president's most important interventionist opponents, including his lifelong hero, Theodore Roosevelt. He wanted to praise Wilson's recent actions in the hope that it would stiffen his spine. But the ex-president called for keeping up a relentless, all-out attack. In his diary, Franklin noted, I back TR's theory. In the ongoing struggle between the president he was supposed to serve and the ex-president he venerated, Franklin seemed to have made his choice. 9 days later, the Germans made that choice irrelevant. On March 18th, they torpedoed 3 American merchant ships. Wilson polled his cabinet as to what he should do. All 10 members voted for war. Josephus Daniels cast his vote with tears in his eyes. On the evening of April 2nd, 1917, Woodrow Wilson finally asked Congress for a declaration of war.
It is a fearful thing to lead this most peaceful people into the most terrible and disastrous of all wars. But the right is more precious than peace, and we shall fight for the things we have always carried nearest our hearts.
Franklin sat next to Secretary Daniels on the House floor. Eleanor was in the gallery, listening breathlessly, she remembered, and then returned home, still half dazed by the sense of impending change. Franklin, eager to do his part and mindful always of Theodore Roosevelt's example, volunteered to serve overseas. President Wilson told him to stay where he was. Neither you nor I nor Franklin Roosevelt, Wilson told Josephus Daniels, has the right to select the place of service to which our country has assigned us.
Just as the United States entered the war, Franklin and Eleanor were living in the house in Washington, and their 2 youngest boys were asleep on the 4th floor of the house, when suddenly the door burst open, and Theodore Roosevelt, whom they had barely met, appeared, grabbed one under each arm, said, "It's far too early for you to be in bed," it was about midnight, and thundered down 4 flights of stairs with these terrified children under his arms, and then plunked them on the floor, and then spent an hour or so orating about the role that he hoped to play in the war while they stood and watched him and tried to figure out who this man was.
The former president was in town to see the current one and to try, like Franklin, to get into the war. He called at the White House the next day. All his previous criticism was now dust in a windy street, he assured Wilson. All he wanted to do was help. The Allies were desperate. It would take time to build and train an American army. He was sure he could raise a division of volunteers virtually overnight, lead it into battle, and inspire the Allies to hold on. He is a great big boy, Wilson told an aide after Roosevelt had left. There is a still had the Secretary of War turn him down. Theodore Roosevelt was half blind, in bad health, out of touch with military developments, and an amateur. The business now at hand, Wilson said later, is undramatic, practical, and of scientific definitiveness and precision. Roosevelt was deeply wounded. This is a very exclusive war, he told a friend, and I have been blackballed by the committee.
First of all, the First World War was not a heroic war anymore. The old idea of we're all crusaders, cavaliers, this is romantic, and we're charging in on our horses. All over. Planes, poison gas. It's not his world. His world is ending. And he gets very old, very rapidly. As if he's a high-intensity light bulb that burned out.
And was working at the PI. And I got a 2 a.m. phone call, and it was June, my father's wife. And my father and June had relocated after a long absence. They had relocated back to San Francisco, and in the last 10 years of his life. So he died at 91, and June was in a panic, and she said the paramedics were here. They just pronounced your father dead. And in that last 10 years, when he relocated back to San Francisco, I became very close to him. We had been estranged, and I got to know him in the last 10 years. And I flew down immediately.
But if he could not fight, his 4 sons could. And one by one, he secured places for them that would nudge them as close as possible to danger. I should be ashamed of my sons if they shirked war, he wrote, just as I should be ashamed of my daughters if they shirked motherhood.
I have always explained to my 4 sons that if there is a war during their lifetime, I wish them to be in a position to explain to their children why they did go to it, and not why they did not go to it.
And I looked at you and I said, "Who is this?" Because I don't know, somebody had followed.
The war was my emancipation and education. Instead of making social calls, I found myself spending 3 days a week in a canteen down at the railroad yards. One afternoon a week distributing free work for the Navy League. 2 days a week visiting the Naval Hospital and contributing whatever time I had left to the Navy Red Cross and the Navy Relief Society. I loved it. I simply ate it up.
The war liberated her. She had to organize her busy household to function without her. She rose often at 5 in the morning and spent 12 hours without a break at the Union Station Red Cross canteen, making coffee and jam sandwiches for the doughboys passing through.
Sometimes I wondered if I could live that way another day. Strength came, however, the thought of Europe and a little sleep could always begin a new day.
One day, the Red Cross asked Eleanor to inspect St. Elizabeth's Hospital, a mental facility filled with sailors and Marines suffering in the aftermath of battle. The prospect terrified her. Her experiences with her alcoholic father and uncles made her frightened of anyone without what she called the power of self-control. She never forgot. Being behind her. or the sight of the dark ward filled with shattered men. Some chained to their beds, muttering, staring. They continued to frighten her, but she came back to see them week after week and lobbied the government and raised private funds to improve the conditions under which they lived. You must do what you think you cannot do, she wrote. She would keep doing that all her life.
Dear Frank, Rosie was in town yesterday and says they all feel quite upset at your appearance at the Tummy Club. As your speaking strengthens tummy. Uncle Warren says one of the papers has pictures of you and Murphy side by side. All this rather upsets me, I confess. Mama.
On July 4th, 1917, Franklin addressed the annual Tammany Hall celebration in New York. He assured his mother afterwards it had been a purely patriotic event, part of the larger war effort. In fact, it was a signal to Boss Murphy and the big city Democrats that once the fighting ended, he would no longer be their enemy. To succeed in post-war politics, he would need the bosses he had once fought so hard. Meanwhile, he did all he could to strengthen and speed up the Navy. Daniels overruled his plan to build hundreds of small craft to patrol American harbors that were not under any real threat. I fear buying a lot of junk, he wrote. But when the secretary also opposed a far grander scheme to eliminate the submarine menace by laying 500,000 nets and mines between Scotland and Norway, he went over his head to the president himself.
Chicago Post. Mr. Daniels has only one virile-minded, hard-fisted civilian assistant. But curiously enough, his name is Roosevelt.
Privately, Franklin continued to be scornful of his slow-moving boss and never abandoned hope of supplanting him as secretary. But he also learned lessons from Daniels that would prove essential to him later. How to work his will with Congress, and how to keep control out of the hands of ambitious military men who assumed they knew better than civilians.
FDR took from the First World War a great sense of the bureaucratic con. He always understood where and not done things that his superiors wanted. We forget sometimes how important Woodrow Wilson and the legacy of Wilson was to Roosevelt's generation. He spent 7 years next door to Wilson's White House. Wilson was hugely important to him, and he learned from Wilson's mistakes, but also in serving that administration, he came to understand politics in a very practical level.
In the summer of 1918, Roosevelt finally persuaded his chief to let him sail for Europe on an inspection tour. If Franklin Roosevelt could not fight, at least he could see the fighting for himself.
The good old ocean is so absolutely normal, just as it has always been. Sometimes tumbling about, throwing spray like this morning. Sometimes gently lolling about with occasional points of light, like tonight. But always something known, an old friend of moods and power. But now, though the ocean looks unchanged, the doubled number on lookout shows that even here, the hand of the Hun false god is reaching out to defy nature. That 10 miles ahead of this floating city of souls, a torpedo may be waiting to start on its quick run. We can never get our good old ocean back again until that God and the people who have set him up are utterly cut down and purged.
The enemy torpedo he feared never materialized. But an enemy submarine was spotted several miles away. And over the years, in Roosevelt's retelling, the American destroyer and the German submarine grew closer and closer, until he was claiming it had come up first on one side of his ship and then the other.
Dearest Ted, you and your brothers are playing your parts in the greatest of the world's great days. What man of gallant spirit does not envy you? You are having your crowded hours of glorious life. You have seized the great chance as was seized by those who fought at Gettysburg, Waterloo, Agincourt, Arbella, and Marathon.
He was at Sagamore Hill doing routine correspondence when Phil Thompson of the Associated Press came to see him on July 16, 1918. Thompson was a friend of Roosevelt's and said, the New York Sun has just received a telegram. Part of it's been censored, but it says, watch Oyster Bay for, and then it's blank. When Roosevelt saw that telegram, he said, one of my boys is in trouble.
Two of them had already been in trouble. First, Archie's knee and elbow had been shattered by German shells, and he had been awarded the French Croix de Guerre. Ted had been gassed, leading his men on the front lines in one battle, and been awarded the Silver Star for his gallantry in another. Kermit was unhurt, but he had survived several close calls fighting with the British Army in Mesopotamia. He, too, had been decorated for his bravery. I wish to heaven that it was my worthless old body that was exposed to the danger in the place of my sons, their father had told a friend. But I would not have them elsewhere for anything in the world. Quentin, the youngest and perhaps the best loved of the Roosevelt children, had joined the Army's fledgling air service. He was engaged to Miss Flora Payne Whitney, but forbidden by her parents to marry until the war was over. When a visitor told Quentin how proud the country was to see all the Roosevelt sons in uniform, he just grinned. Well, he said, you know, it's rather up to us to practice what Father preaches. His fellow flyers in the 95th Kicking Mule Aero Squadron called Quentin the Go-and-Get-'em Man because of his eagerness for combat. On July 5th, 1918, he'd survived his first dogfight. You get so excited that you forget everything except getting the other fellow, he wrote to his mother. On the 10th, he'd shot down a German plane. The last of the lion's brood has been blooded, his proud father said when he heard the news. On the 14th, Quentin had gone up again with his comrades. A stiff wind blew them dangerously deep into Germany. An enemy formation rose to meet them. 14 planes mixed in a general melee, one American pilot remembered, rolling and circling and diving, with the continuous tat-tat-tat-tat of the machine guns. The Americans flew separately back to their base. Quentin never got there. Bullets had riddled his cockpit. His plane plunged into a rutted field.
The next morning at dawn, Phil Thompson, his friend from the Associated Press, was back with the confirming telegrams. And Roosevelt looked at it and he walked in towards the house and he said, how am I going to tell you? How will I how will I break this news to Edith? And so he did, and they issued a statement about how proud they were that their son had gotten to the front, had seen action, and had done his national service.
When the Roosevelt all the time, and Quentin was, I think, about 4 when his father became president. And he was really, in a large sense, the country's little boy. So when he died, this was front page news across the country. There was a town in Pennsylvania which had been named Bismarck that changed its name to Quentin.
To feel that one has inspired a boy to conduct that has resulted in his death is a pretty serious sight for a father. And at the same time, I would not have cared for my boys, and they would not have cared for me, if our relations had not been just along that line.
Roosevelt remained stoical in public, but his coachman came upon him in the stable, his face buried in the mane of his son's pony, murmuring, "Poor Quenty, poor Quenty." A German soldier photographed Quentin's corpse. Copies of the picture made their way, so he did not suffer, and it is a glorious way to die. A few weeks later, she saw her uncle. She was still his favorite niece, and he had no wish ever to wound her. But, he said, it was her duty to persuade her husband to enlist and get to the front in uniform before this war ended. Eleanor was annoyed. Only Franklin could make such a decision, and President Wilson himself had told him to stay at his post. Meanwhile, overseas on his inspection tour, her husband had been having the time of his life. In London, Roosevelt bought himself 3 pairs of silk pajamas, praised the heroism of the men he called "my Marines" at the Battle of Belleau Wood, chatted with King George V, who told him he'd never seen a German gentleman, and had a brief encounter with the man with whom he would one day direct a far bigger war.
It was Monday, July 29th, 1918, at Gray's Inn in London. Great dinner of the war ministers. FDR was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Winston Churchill was there, and Churchill was quite grumpy about being there. And to FDR's everlasting chagrin, Churchill didn't remember at all, which is possibly, for a politician, the single worst thing that can happen to you. He made no impression, whatever.
In France, Franklin visited his wounded cousins Ted and Archie, accompanied a drunken congressional delegation to the Folies Bergère, and tirelessly toured the battlefields in a special costume he designed for himself. At one battered village, he was allowed to fire an artillery, and at a crossroads called the Angle of Death, he stood in the open, snapping photographs long enough for the Germans to call in artillery. He left his suitcase behind. The more I think of it, he wrote Eleanor, the more I feel that being only 36, my place is not at a hope to get himself a Navy commission and join a naval battery on the Western Front. But first, he traveled to Scotland home. Once aboard the USS Leviathan, he collapsed in his cabin with double pneumonia. When the ship docked in New York, orderlies had to carry him ashore. An ambulance brought him to his mother's house. He was carried to a guest room upstairs. Eleanor unpacked her husband's luggage and came upon a bundle of letters tied with a string. They were addressed to him and written by her own one-time social secretary, Lucy Mercer. At that moment, she remembered later, the bottom fell out of my own particular world. And she was forced, she said, to face myself, my surroundings, my world, honestly, for the first time. Lucy was beautiful, cultured, soft-spoken, 6 years hard times. Tammy Roosevelt had recommended her not long after the young Roosevelts arrived in Washington 5 years before. And Eleanor had been pleased with the way she had helped steer her through the shoals. Lucy Mercer had been part of the Roosevelt household for 3 years. The children liked her. So did Sarah. She is so sweet and attractive, she wrote, and she loves you, Eleanor. But she also came to love Franklin. His ringing laugh, Lucy remembered. All the ridiculous things he used to say. His extraordinarily beautiful head.
Lucy Mercer was a beautiful, sweet-natured, nice woman who adored the husband of her employer. She adored Franklin, and he had a deep need to find substitutes for the kind of unquestioning adoration that his mother had given him. And Lucy Mercer was that person. She was younger than he. She thought everything he did was marvelous. He was sweet to her, and she fell in love with him, and he fell in love with her.
When Eleanor and the children were away at Campobello, Lucy and Franklin had spent time together, dining at the homes of discreet friends, sailing and picnicking along the Potomac. Alice Roosevelt Longworth, Theodore Roosevelt's oldest daughter, isn't she lovely? Was all you could say. Rumors may have reached Eleanor. She had let her secretary go in June of 1917, but within 2 weeks, Lucy had enlisted in the Navy and was conveniently assigned to Franklin's office at the Navy Department. At Campobello that summer, Eleanor worried about where her husband was and what he was up to. In October, Franklin's boss, Josephus Daniels, dismissed Miss Mercer from the service. The threat to the Roosevelt marriage seemed to have been lifted. But now, more than a year later, it was clear that Lucy Mercer was still an important part of her husband's life.
I'm sure he regretted her being his wife, but I think Franklin Roosevelt didn't dwell very much on the impact that he had on people. I mean, he was, in many ways, a very selfish, a very self-centered person.
Lucy's relationship with Franklin confirmed every fear Eleanor Roosevelt had ever harbored about herself. No one would ever love her for long. She had children, but she also would not provide him with another penny, would make sure he did not inherit his beloved Springwood. Louis Howe weighed in too. A divorce, he said, would end Franklin's political career. Franklin promised never to see Lucy Mercer again. But the experience taught her, she would write many years later, that practically no one is entirely bad or entirely good. That a man must be what he is.
All her life, she told all your intimacy with Mrs. Roosevelt, and she would tell you the story of his betrayal and how she had dealt with it. I think she's extremely bitter at you. Their marriage went on, and it would be one of the great partnerships in the history of the world, the United States.
At 11 o'clock in the morning on November 11th, 1918, the Great War ended in an Allied victory. The feeling of relief and thankfulness was beyond description, Eleanor wrote.
New York, November 19th, 1918. Well, we have seen the mighty days. We have lived through the most tremendous tragedy in the history of civilization. In spite of our pacifists and sentimentalists and tricky politicians, America did finally play a real part in the war. We played it manfully. Ted and Kermit have taken part in the last fighting, and I believe they are now walking toward the Rhine. Archie, really badly crippled, is back with us.
I think that Theodore Roosevelt was in a lot of pain through much of his life. Physical pain, emotional loss, suffering from emotional loss. And yes, he wanted to be courageous in the face of pain, but he also didn't want to inflict that pain on us, on his audience. That was for him to have to deal with. And he'd known it since childhood, all his life. And he'd known loss all his life. And this brevity of life is painful for him to face.
Dear Ted, Father was in your old nursery and loved the view. And as it got dusk, he watched the dancing of waves and spoke of the happiness of being home and made little plans for me. I think he had made up his mind that he would have to suffer for some time to come. And with high courage had adjusted himself to bear it. He was very sweet one day. Since Quentin was killed, he has been sad. Only Ethel's little girl had the power to make him marry.
January 5th, 1919. Theodore Roosevelt. He'd recently been hospitalized for inflammatory rheumatism, was still weak, weary, and was certain that 1920 would bring him back to power at last. Meanwhile, he needed rest. As he closed his book and got ready for bed that evening, he said to Edith, "More Hill." He never woke up. He was just 60 years old. Archie cabled his brothers. The old lion is dead. I have never known another person so vital, the editor William Allen White wrote, nor another man so dear. Death had to take him sleeping, Vice President Thomas Marshall told the press. For if Roosevelt had been awake, there would have been a fight. Top grave at Oyster Bay. A New York police captain said to Roosevelt's sister Corinne, "Do you remember the fun of him? It was not only that he was a great man, but oh, there was such fun in being led by him."
My sorrow was so keen for the young who died that the edge of my grief is blunted when death comes to the old, my own generation. For in the nature of things we must soon die anyhow. And we have warmed both hands before the fire of life.
Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt had been unable to attend the funeral. They were at sea on their way to Europe. He was going back to dismantle naval installations. She insisted she go along too, to look after him, she said. His health was still fragile. So was their marriage. Theodore Roosevelt's death stunned them both. "Man I ever knew," he said. He had been a hero to Eleanor too, and a vivid link to her beloved father. But Theodore Roosevelt's death was about to provide Franklin Roosevelt with a great opportunity.
Tomorrow night on the Roosevelts, Franklin Roosevelt is stricken with the mysterious disease.
His legs felt funny and he felt feverish. And he went upstairs to go to bed. And he never walked without help again.
But will his secret keep him from the one?
To a new deal for the American people.
Part 4 of the Roosevelts, an intimate history, tomorrow night.
Come on, you gotta check this out.
And this guy's attention and like come up with a whole bunch of reasons why. It's probably George Odell and prejudice and Sexton and the people from that
Open up a whole new world of possibilities. That is really cool. Stuff that doesn't exist. Oh my God, is this what I think it is?
This is nature's as ever been.
It's incredible up here.
To learn more about the rich history and legacy of one of the most influential families in American history, go to pbs.org/The Roosevelts. The Roosevelts, An Intimate History, is available on Blu-ray and DVD. The companion book is also available. To order, visit shoppbs.org or call 1-800-PLAY-PBS. Also available for download from iTunes.
Previously on the Roosevelts, Theodore was denied a return to the White House.
He left power too soon. He had to be in the arena.
Then charted a deadly course into the Amazon.
We started down the river of doubt into the unknown.
While Eleanor and Franklin were rocked by betrayal.
Eleanor Roosevelt never forgave or forgot what he had done.
And now, part 4 of the Roosevelts, an intimate history.
Campobello was one of the 2 or 3 most important places in Franklin Roosevelt's life. He learned to sail. His father had taught him that he'd been going there since he was a little boy. And it was also the place where his children got to know him. He led the kids on long walks around the island. And he went to Eleanor Roosevelt. It was the first place she had ever had a home that belonged really to her and her husband, not to her mother.
On Tuesday afternoon, July 6, 1920, Sarah Delano Roosevelt was at work in the garden of her father's old house, overlooking the hut. Her daughter-in-law and the grandchildren off to Campobello for the summer. Her son Franklin was far away, attending the Democratic convention. A friend had wonderful news. Franklin had just been nominated for Vice President of the United States. Still another office his fifth cousin Theodore had once held. Sarah was pleased but not surprised. She had taught her boy that nothing he ever really wanted was beyond his grasp. She wrote him right away, sending her regards to the son she now believed would be our future president. All my love and interest goes to you, she said, and as always, is centered in you.
I think Franklin Roosevelt is simply irresistible. If you see him on film with that face and that charm and that infinite, you can't take your eyes off him. And it almost doesn't matter what he's saying. There's just something riveting about it. And then I think there's just a great drama about a guy who is slick and charming and graceful as a young man who goes through this unbelievable testing and then somehow finds within himself the ambition and the power to decide to come back, and then comes back, and then becomes the most important president of the 20th century. It's a pretty good story.
During the 1920s, memories of Theodore Roosevelt would begin to fade, and the public's attention shifted to Franklin and Eleanor. The two would find themselves living altogether new kinds of lives. Awkward and diffident, Eleanor would struggle to emerge from the relationship with her own social secretary, to become a public figure and a political power in her own right. While Franklin, active, ambitious, gregarious, would suddenly find himself immobilized, powerless, isolated, his career at an apparent end. And then, displaying qualities of courage and compassion even he may not have suspected he possessed, he would reemerge in time to help restore the faith of a badly frightened country.
To some extent, Franklin Roosevelt's ease of life before the polio might not have equipped him for being the leader that he was. There was ambition, but not the ambition attached to that huge substance that later came after the polio. What the polio did, I think, was to just transform him in many ways. He learned by withstanding that adversity that he could come through a trial of fire, and thereby he could help other people do the same.
This past year has rather got the better of me. It has been so full of all kinds of things that I still am breathless. Hunted
During the 20 months that preceded Franklin Roosevelt's nomination for vice president in 1920, American life seemed to have turned. Roosevelt, who had hoped to regain the White House, had died. Women finally could vote in every state. A new, exciting music would fill new airwaves, and prohibition would turn millions of Americans into lawbreakers. Wall Street climbed steadily upward as unregulated speculation in stocks, real estate, and commodities attracted more and more citizens. It seemed as if the good times would never end. Aboard the warship that bore Woodrow Wilson home from peace talks in France, the president told Franklin and Eleanor that the United States must enter the new League of Nations that promised to prevent another war, or it would break the heart of the world. In the end, Wilson's isolationist enemies and his own stubborn refusal to compromise combined to keep America out of the League and broke Wilson's heart. He himself was a virtual prisoner in the White House, partially paralyzed by a stroke, unwilling to be seen or heard in public. American voters, sick of war, plagued by soaring post-war reform, and were increasingly uninterested in events overseas. At Chicago in June of 1920, the Republicans nominated for president an amiable but undistinguished senator from Ohio, Warren G. Harding. To run against him, the Democrats settled on another Ohioan to balance the ticket. He was an Easterner with an independent reputation, had a good record in wartime Washington, and most important, he bore a last name the party hoped would appeal to independent voters who had planned to cast their ballots for Theodore Roosevelt.
Washington, July 17th, 1920. Dearest Babs, today I went down to the station and met Governor Cox. A huge cheering crowd, more enthusiastic than any Washington crowd I have ever seen. Tomorrow we see the president at 10:30. I still hope to leave Saturday afternoon and be with you all at Campobello Sunday evening. I can hardly wait. I miss you so much. Kiss the chicks. It is almost a month since I saw them. Your devoted F.
The two Democratic candidates went to the White House the next morning to get the ailing president's blessing. Tears filled Cox's eyes when Wilson was wheeled onto the south portico, a woolen shawl around his shoulders despite the summer heat, his useless left arm dangling. In a voice that could barely be heard, he thanked them for coming. Cox vowed to continue to call for U.S. entry into the League of Nations. Wilson managed to say he was grateful before he was wheeled back inside. Franklin Roosevelt would never forget the sight of the president he'd served for 7 years, defeated and helpless. On July 25th, 1920, Franklin Roosevelt steered the destroyer Hatfield into Passamaquoddy Bay, went ashore to join. From now on, everything in the Roosevelts' lives would be subject to public scrutiny. Your informal footage of the Democratic vice presidential nominee and his family. Franklin was a natural. Eleanor was not. She was still virtually unknown to the public. When she claimed to have no publishable photographs of herself, one Washington paper printed a picture of someone else, a home woman who seems especially to dislike the official limelight, and went on to quote a patronizing friend who said,